Imagine for a moment a boy who has spent every night of his life in a small, dark cupboard beneath a staircase. A boy who has never owned a coat that was truly his own, never held a coin that he did not have to give straight back. Never once in 11 long years been told that anything in the whole wide world belonged to him. Imagine that same boy standing now in the cold stone belly of a bank run by goblins, deep underground, further down than any city sewer, watching a heavy iron door swing slowly open before him. And imagine the light that spills out of that little vault, a warm and golden glow rising off mountain upon mountain of gold coins. Tall, glittering columns of silver, and untidy heaps of small bronze pieces scattered like fallen leaves. All of it, every last coin of it, is his. It has been waiting for him in the dark all this time, patient and silent, saved and sealed and kept, and he never knew. Harry Potter, who had grown up believing he had nothing, discovers in that single breathless moment that he is, and always has been, quietly and unmistakably rich. And so, the gentle question settles over us, soft as a blanket being drawn up to the chin. The question we are going to follow together tonight through all its long and winding turns. Where did it come from, all that gold? Not the surface answer, not merely that his parents left it to him, but the deeper and older answer beneath. How did an ordinary-looking family, a family that was never counted among the grand and glittering pure-blood dynasties of the wizarding world, a family that some of the proudest old houses looked down upon and even called traitors, come to fill a vault beneath London with more gold than one small boy could ever hope to spend? Before we sink any deeper into that story, let me softly say one small thing, and then, I promise, I will not interrupt the quiet again. If you find that this calm and unhurried kind of storytelling helps you drift, if it soothes the noise of the day and lets your shoulders finally come down from around your ears, then it would mean a great deal if you would gently tap the little button to subscribe. It costs you nothing at all, and it quietly helps this small channel keep going. And more than that, it helps other tired souls out there, the ones lying awake in the dark just as you might be, discover these long, peaceful journeys through the wizarding world and find their own way toward rest. That is all. Now, let us settle back in and let the story carry us onward. Because here is the curious thing, the thing that makes the Potter fortune such a lovely puzzle to unravel slowly in the dark. In the world of wizards, wealth and blood did not always travel together, no matter how much certain families wished that they did. There were households that wore their pure blood ancestry like a crown. Families who kept careful lists of who was and who was not descended from wizards all the way down. And some of these families were indeed fabulously rich, their manor houses full of dark treasures and their vaults heavy with inherited gold. But there were others, just as pure in that narrow and prideful sense of the word, who had fallen into utter ruin, who lived in crumbling shacks and sold off the last heirlooms of their name for a handful of coins. And there were families like the Weasleys, warm and ancient and proud, who had almost no money at all, whose children wore second-hand robes and carried second-hand wands. So the tidy little idea that the oldest blood always meant the deepest pockets was never really true. And the Potters are perhaps the gentlest proof of that. The Potters were old, yes, wonderfully old, their roots reaching back many hundreds of years into the soft green history of wizarding Britain. And they were comfortable, more than comfortable. They were genuinely well off in a way that let them live without worry or want. Yet they were never invited into that closed and self-satisfied circle of families who fancied themselves the truest and purest of all. The Potters, you see, had a habit of marrying for love rather than for lineage, of welcoming those born to Muggle parents, of caring far more for kindness than for the supposed purity of a bloodline. And so the proud old houses left the Potter name off their sacred lists and turned up their noses. And yet the Potters went on being respected and being loved and quietly, steadily, being rich. The question of exactly how they came to be so is the thread we will follow, patiently, night after night, sentence after gentle sentence, until the whole shape of it lies clear before us. Think of how strange it must have felt for Harry, standing there in the vault, to learn all of this at once. For most of his life, he had been told, in 100 small, unkind ways, that he was a burden, that he was nothing, that whatever meager scraps came his way were more than he deserved. He had watched another boy tear open piles of birthday presents while he received a single coat hanger or a pair of old socks, and he had learned to expect nothing and to ask for nothing. And now, here was the truth turning quietly on its head. He had never been poor at all. Somewhere far away, all through those cold cupboard years, there had been gold with his name on it, resting in the dark, gathering no dust because goblins keep their vaults immaculate, simply waiting for the day he would be old enough to be shown the door and told that it was his. The money had been real the whole time. It was only that no one had told him. For the answer, when it finally comes, is not a single answer at all. It is a story told in layers, each one laid softly over the last, like the folds of a warm quilt. And each layer is its own small wonder that we will unfold in its own good time. There is, at the very beginning, a gentle healer who lived nearly 1,000 years ago, a kind and clever man who tended the sick of his village and brewed remedies so gifted that echoes of his craft still ripple through wizarding medicine to this day. And it was his careful hands that first gathered the gold and the land that became the family's foundation. There is, woven in through marriage, a treasure far older and stranger than money, a certain silvery cloak that does not merely hide the one who wears it, but hides them so completely that not even death itself can find them. A cloak passed down through the generations, from a legend at the very dawn of wizarding stories. And there is, much later, in the time of Harry's own grandfather, a single clever invention, a humble little potion meant for nothing grander than taming unruly hair, that swept through the wizarding world and multiplied the family fortune many times over. A healer, a cloak, and a bottle of hair potion. That is the strange and tender recipe of the Potter gold. And there is more still beyond it, other inheritances that would come to Harry from unexpected directions in the years ahead. But we are in no hurry tonight, none at all. We have hours of quiet ahead of us, and every one of these threads deserves to be drawn out slowly and held up to the candlelight and turned over gently in the hand. So let your breathing settle and let your thoughts grow soft and slow. And let the image of that little vault full of impossible gold linger warmly behind your eyes. We will begin, as all the best stories do, at the very beginning, with a boy who did not yet know that any of it was waiting for him, and with the long line of loving and clever hands that had been saving it up for him, all through the patient centuries, without his ever knowing their names. Long before Harry Potter ever heard the word Gringotts, long before he knew that a mountain of gold was waiting for him beneath the city of London. He lived in a small house on a very ordinary street, in a very ordinary town, believing with all his heart that he owned almost nothing at all. The house belonged to his aunt and his uncle, Petunia and Vernon Dursley, and it sat in a neat row of houses that looked so alike that a tired traveler might have walked past it 100 times without ever noticing which door was theirs. Everything about that street was tidy and careful and unremarkable, and the family who lived at number 4 wanted more than anything in the world to be seen as tidy and careful and unremarkable too, which is part of the reason they treated the quiet, dark-haired boy in their care the way they did. For the first 11 years of his life, Harry slept in a cupboard. It was the small cupboard tucked under the staircase, the little triangular space where most families keep a broken umbrella, a stack of old coats, a vacuum cleaner, and a few boxes that no one has opened in years. In that narrow space, with the wooden underside of the stairs sloping low above his head, Harry had a thin mattress and a single dusty bulb hanging from a cord, and spiders for company in the corners. And this was the whole of his kingdom. When he woke in the morning, it was often to the sound of his aunt rapping on the little door, and he would lie there in the dark for a moment, listening to the ordinary noises of a family that did not think of him as truly one of them. He did not know, as he lay there, that he was one of the wealthiest boys in the whole of magical Britain. Nobody had ever told him. Nobody meant to. The clothes he wore were never his own to begin with. Every shirt, every jumper, every pair of trousers had once belonged to his cousin Dudley, a large and pampered boy who was given so much that he could not possibly wear it all. And so the great mountains of things he grew out of, or grew tired of, were passed down to Harry in faded and stretched and shapeless heaps. The garments hung off him like sails on a becalmed ship, far too big across the shoulders. The cuffs rolled and rolled again, the colors washed out to gray by years of laundering. His shoes came from the same source, scuffed and worn soft at the heel. And when at last he was given a pair of spectacles, it was the cheapest kind, held together at the bridge with a great deal of ordinary sticky tape, because no one thought it worth the trouble to have them properly mended. To look at him, standing thin and untidy at the edge of the school photograph, you would have guessed that he was a poor boy from a poor family, a child who had never in his life owned a single fine or costly thing. And that, in a way, was true. And in a far larger way, it was not true at all. And the strange gap between those two truths is the quiet heart of this whole story. Because Harry had a fortune. He had a great deal of gold, real gold, sitting untouched and undisturbed while he grew up hungry for seconds at the supper table. His mother and his father, James and Lily Potter, had died when he was little more than a baby, and they had left behind for their only son the wealth that their family had gathered over many long centuries. Yet the Dursleys never breathed a word of it. Whether they truly understood the size of what waited for him is difficult to say, for they closed their eyes and their ears to everything about the world Harry came from, and they wanted no part of it in their house. But they knew at the very least that his parents had not left him penniless, and still they let him wear the cast-off clothes of another child, and still they gave him the cupboard beneath the stairs, and still they let him believe that he was a burden with nothing to his name and no place that was truly his. The gold sat in its vault, patient as stone, and the boy who owned it slept among the spiders and did not dream of it, because he did not know that it was there. It is a curious thing to think about, the way a person can be surrounded by scarcity and yet be rich all along. Harry counted himself lucky to be given anything at all. He learned early to expect very little, to make himself small, to be grateful for the smallest kindness, and to be unsurprised by unkindness. And none of that has anything to do with money. And yet, money hovers behind it all like a shape half seen through fog. Somewhere out in the wide, magical world, there were people who spoke of the Potters with respect, who knew the family as old and well-regarded and comfortable, who would have been astonished to learn that the last of that line was sleeping in a cupboard in a Muggle town, wearing a jumper 4 sizes too large, wondering whether there would be enough breakfast left over for him. The 2 pictures could hardly have been further apart, the grand old name and the forgotten little boy. And for 11 long years, those 2 pictures never once touched. And then, on a wild and rain-soaked night, the truth came for him. A giant of a man named Rubeus Hagrid arrived to carry Harry away toward the school where his parents had once been happy. And among the many wonders that unfolded in the days that followed, there came a journey deep beneath the streets of London into the vaults of Gringotts, the bank of the wizarding world. There, far below the ground, guarded by goblins and reached by a rattling cart that plunged through the dark, a small, round door was opened for him. Behind it lay the truth that no one had ever spoken aloud in the house on Privet Drive. Mounds of gold coins, towers of silver, heaps of small bronze pieces. More money than Harry had ever imagined could belong to one person. All of it his. All of it left to him by the mother and father he could scarcely remember. He stood and stared, and he could hardly take it in. This boy, who had learned to want almost nothing, suddenly shown that he had a great deal. Think for a moment of the distance between the cupboard and the vault. In the one, a narrow, dark space beneath the stairs, a thin mattress, a single dim bulb, a boy who owned nothing. In the other, a chamber of the bank filled to the ceiling with the gathered wealth of centuries, and the same boy standing in the middle of it, blinking, unsure whether he was allowed to be glad. He had spent 11 years being told in 100 small, silent ways that he mattered very little and was owed nothing at all. And now, the world was quietly telling him the opposite, that he had been cared for after all, that his parents had thought of his future long before he was old enough to know he had one. The gold was not really the gift. The gift was the knowledge that he had been loved enough to be provided for, that somewhere before the ending of their lives, 2 people had set aside a treasure so that their son would never truly want. Where all of that gold had come from, how a single family had gathered so much over so many hundreds of years, is a story that stretches back far beyond James and Lily, back through healers and inventors and old names half lost to time. But before we follow that thread into the deep past, it is enough tonight to rest in this one gentle truth. The boy in the cupboard had been rich all along and simply had not known it, and the not knowing had never once made the love behind it any less real. To understand where the gold in that Gringotts vault truly began, we have to travel back a very long way, far past the years of Harry's parents, far past his grandparents, far past every carriage and candle and stone hall you might picture when you think of the old wizarding world, all the way to the 12th century, to a soft green corner of the English county of Gloucestershire, to a small and unremarkable village named Stinchcombe. It is the kind of place that time tends to forget. A scattering of cottages and low garden walls set among gentle hills, with sheep on the slopes and smoke rising slowly from the chimneys. And it is here, more than 800 years ago, that a man was born whose quiet life would echo forward through the centuries until it reached a boy under a staircase who did not yet know his own name in the world of magic. That man was called Linfred, and because he lived in that village, he came to be known, in the way of those simple times, as Linfred of Stinchcombe. Linfred was a wizard, though the word may have sat lightly upon him, for he did not think of himself as a grand or powerful figure, and he did not live behind high walls or guard his gifts with suspicion. He was, by every account that has come down to us, a gentle and rather eccentric man, the sort of person a village grows fond of without quite being able to say why. A soul who wandered his own garden at odd hours and muttered happily to his plants and lost track of the time and forgot where he had left his own shoes. His neighbors, who were of course ordinary folk with no magic of their own, regarded him with warm and puzzled affection, and they gave him a nickname, as villages have always done, a kindly and teasing little name that stuck to him for the whole of his life. They called him the Potterer. Now that word deserves a moment of gentle attention, because it is the seed from which the whole family name would one day grow. To potter, in that soft old English sense, means to busy oneself pleasantly and without hurry, to move from one small task to another, to fuss over little things in a happy and unfocused way, to tinker and dawdle and drift through a long afternoon with a great many jars and no particular plan. And that, to the eyes of his neighbors, was exactly what Linfred appeared to be forever doing. They saw him pottering about his cottage and his overgrown garden, stirring pots that smelled of strange, sweet herbs, grinding roots with a stone, bottling curious liquids and holding them up to the light, muttering to himself all the while, entirely absorbed and entirely content. They did not know that his pottering was in truth the careful, patient work of a healer, and that the little jars held remedies quite unlike anything their world had ever seen. To them, he was simply the dear, dotty old potterer, and the name was spoken with a smile. But there was a great deal more to Linfred than harmless fussing, and this is the heart of why he matters to our long story. Linfred was a healer, and he was a very gifted one, and his gift he gave freely to the people around him. In those days, the ordinary folk of England had almost nothing to lean upon when sickness came into a house. There were no true doctors in a village like Stinchcombe, no medicines worthy of the name, only old wives with their brews and barbers with their blades, and a great deal of frightened prayer. And when a fever swept through the cottages, or a child began to cough and could not stop, or a wound turned hot and would not close, there was often little that anyone could do but wait and hope and grieve. Into that hard and helpless world came Linfred, quietly, without fanfare, asking nothing, and he began simply to help. He would go to the homes where suffering had settled, and he would sit by the beds of the ill, and from the folds of his robes he would bring out one of his strange little bottles, and the sick would drink, and slowly, wonderfully, they would begin to mend. Fevers that should have carried a person away would break and fade by morning. Wounds that should have festered would knit clean and whole. Coughs would ease, aches would soften, color would return to gray faces, and children who had been failing would sit up and ask for bread. The villagers did not understand it, and being kindly and unsuspicious people, they did not much try to. For they saw only that where the potterer went, healing followed, and that was enough to make them love him. They believed, quite naturally, that he simply had a wonderful knack with country cures, a lucky old man with a good hand for herbs. And Linfred was wise enough and gentle enough to let them believe it, for it kept his secret safe, and it kept them at ease. What his neighbors could not know was that Linfred was inventing, in that cluttered cottage, the very foundations of magical medicine, remedies and potions so far ahead of their age that some of them would still be brewed and trusted many hundreds of years later. The careful drafts he mixed to mend broken and damaged flesh were the distant ancestors of the potions that healers would one day use to regrow bone itself. And the warming brews he pressed upon the shivering and the chilled were the early forebears of the remedy that would come to be known for driving a cold clean out of the body in a burst of steam. He was, though the word would have meant nothing in Stinchcombe, a pioneer, one of the first of his kind to turn magic patiently toward the simple and holy work of easing pain, and he did it not for glory and not for coin, but because it was in his nature to be kind. And yet, the coin came anyway, quietly, as it so often does to those who are good at their work and gentle in their manner. For Linfred did not only tend the poor of his own village. Word of the marvelous old healer spread, as such words do, from cottage to cottage and from valley to valley, and in time people of some means began to seek him out, folk who could afford to be grateful and who pressed upon him what they could: a coin, a gift, a little parcel of land, a share of a good harvest, all offered in thanks for a life saved or a child spared. Linfred, who had no greed in him, took what was given without ever demanding it, and because he asked for so little and helped so many, the gratitude of a great many people gathered slowly around him like snow settling softly through a long winter night, until without ever having set out to do so, this dreamy, muttering, kindly old man had become quietly and comfortably prosperous. So it was that when Linfred of Stinchcombe at last came to the end of his gentle days, he left behind him not only the memory of his kindness, which lingered in that village long after the cottage stood empty, but also a real and lasting inheritance, a store of gold and a spread of good land, to be divided among his children. It was not the roaring fortune that would come to the family in later centuries, not yet, but it was the true and humble beginning of it, the first small pile of coin from which everything else would grow, earned not by conquest or cunning or the accident of noble blood, but by patient hands and healing draughts and the simple willingness to sit beside the suffering and make them well. And his children, carrying that inheritance forward, carried also his nickname, the fond and teasing name the villagers had given him, so that the potterer became, in the mouths of his descendants, simply Potter, a name that would travel down through the long, quiet years and be spoken at last over the cradle of a boy in Godric's Hollow. From a gentle healer in a forgotten village, pottering happily among his jars, the whole shining story of the Potter fortune had begun. To understand how the Potter family first came to hold gold and land, we must go back to the quiet cottage of Linfred of Stinchcombe, that gentle man of the 12th century whom the village so fondly called the Potterer, and we must watch, slowly and softly, the way that a single life of patient healing can turn, over many years, into something as solid and lasting as an inheritance. Linfred did not set out to grow rich. That is the first and kindest truth of this part of the story. He was a man who cared for his neighbors, both the ordinary folk of the village who never suspected he was a wizard and the magical families who came to him more quietly. And it was out of that caring, out of long evenings spent over simmering cauldrons and small clay pots, that his fortune was slowly, almost accidentally, gathered. Linfred was a maker of remedies. He brewed cures for the small miseries of the body, the aches and chills and fevers that trouble every household in every century. And he did it with such skill and such tenderness that people came to him from far beyond his own village, walking the muddy lanes with their sick children and their worried faces, certain that the kind man in the cottage on the hill would have something to help them. And he almost always did. Where the muggles of Stinchcombe believed him to be a harmless and slightly eccentric fellow pottering about in his garden among the herbs and the steam, the magical world knew something closer to the truth, which was that Linfred was quietly inventing a whole family of potions that would outlast him by centuries. Among the cures he devised were the early forms of remedies that any young witch or wizard would recognize today. For the histories tell us that Linfred was the forerunner, the very first maker, of potions that would one day be refined into Skelgrow, the bone-mending drought, and into Pepperup, the warming potion that chases away a head cold and leaves a little steam curling from the ears. In his own time, these were rougher and simpler things, first attempts, gentle experiments, but they worked, and word of them spread, and that spreading word was the beginning of the family's gold. Imagine, if you will, the slow steam rising from a low fire, the shelves crowded with dried roots and pressed flowers, and little pots of ointment, the careful measuring of one ingredient against another until at last a mixture was found that soothed rather than harmed, that mended rather than lingered. Each success of this kind was a small, quiet triumph, and each one added, in its own way, to the reputation of the man who lived in the cottage, so that his name traveled from village to village on the grateful lips of those he had cured, carried further than he himself ever walked. For every grateful family that left his door carrying a stoppered bottle of relief also left behind a coin, or a sack of grain, or the promise of a favor. And Linfred, who was generous by nature and never grasping, nonetheless found that a lifetime of small payments, given freely and gladly by people he had helped, added up in the end to a genuinely comfortable estate. It is worth pausing here, in the warm dark of this thought, to notice how different this beginning was from the way many old families gathered their wealth. There was no conquest in it, no seizing of land by force, no marriage arranged purely for money, no cold accumulation. Linfred grew wealthy by being useful, by easing pain, by sending people home lighter than they had come. His remedies filled the family coffers, not because he charged a high price, but because so very many people needed him, and needed him again, year after year, through the long, slow turning of the seasons. A healer who is truly loved is never short of visitors, and Linfred was truly loved. And so the coins came in a steady, quiet stream, like water filling a basin drop by patient drop, until, almost without anyone noticing, the basin is full. With that gold, and with the good standing that came from it, Linfred was able to acquire land, and land in those distant days was the deepest and steadiest kind of wealth a family could own. Fields and pasture, a good house, the security of a place that was truly one's own. These were the things that a life of healing bought for him, and they were the things he meant, above all, to leave behind. For Linfred was not only a healer, but a family man, and the histories record that he was the father of 7 children, a whole houseful of sons and daughters growing up in the warmth of that busy, herb-scented home, learning perhaps a little of their father's gentleness and his careful, curious way with the world. When at last his long and useful life drew to its close, Linfred did what any loving father would wish to do. He divided what he had gathered among those 7 children, passing to each of them a share of the gold he had earned and the land he had bought, so that not one of them was left without something to begin their own lives upon. This is the moment, quiet and undramatic as it was, when the Potter fortune truly became an inheritance rather than merely one man's earnings. A fortune that is spent when its maker dies is only a wage. A fortune that is passed on, that survives the person who made it and goes forward into the next generation, is something else entirely, and it was Linfred's careful sharing that turned his healer's gold into a family legacy. We should not imagine, in all of this, that the potters became suddenly grand, or that they walked about draped in riches, for that would come much later, and by a very different road. What Linfred left his children was a modest but real wealth, the difference between a family that must struggle for every meal and a family that is comfortable, secure, unworried, able to raise its children in ease and to keep its head above the small storms of ordinary life. It was the foundation, not the whole building. It was the first floor laid down, strong and level, upon which all the later fortunes of the family would eventually be raised, and it mattered enormously precisely because it came first. Through the eldest of those 7 children, the main line of the family would carry on, and with it the land and the name and the quiet prosperity that Linfred had begun. Generation after generation, the Potters would remain a settled, established family, neither poor nor extravagantly rich, holding the gold and the good repute that their healer ancestor had earned. And that steadiness would carry them safely through the centuries until, far down the years, a rare magical treasure and a clever invention would lift them to true wealth. But none of that could have happened without this first gentle beginning, without the coins pressed into a kind man's hand by grateful neighbors, without the 7 shares divided so lovingly among his children. And so, as we let this chapter settle softly into the quiet, it is worth holding on to the shape of what Linfred truly gave. He gave his family more than money. He gave them a start, a name that meant helpfulness, a memory of a man who grew rich by being good, and a small, strong seed of wealth planted in the soft ground of care. From remedies for aching bones and streaming colds, from long, patient nights over a warm cauldron, the first Potter gold was gathered, and it was passed down, hand to hand and heart to heart, into the sleeping centuries that lay ahead, waiting gently for the next part of the story to begin. Long before there was a boy named Harry, long before there was a vault of gold waiting quietly beneath the streets of London, there was a story that wizarding children were told at bedtime, in soft voices, in the warm hush before sleep, and it is a story that we can let carry us gently now, because it is one of the oldest tales the magical world has ever kept. It is called The Tale of the 3 Brothers, and for hundreds and hundreds of years it was thought to be only that, a tale, a little fable meant to teach a lesson and to lull small witches and wizards into their dreams. Yet woven inside its quiet lines, hidden the way a thread of gold is hidden inside a plain gray cloak, there lies a piece of true family history, a history that reaches all the way down the centuries and touches, ever so softly, the family into which Harry Potter was born. The tale begins, as so many old tales do, with 3 brothers walking together along a lonely road at twilight. They traveled through a landscape that was wild and empty, and in time they came to a river too deep to wade across and too dangerous to swim. A river that had drowned many travelers who had tried to cross it before them. But these 3 brothers were skilled in the magical arts, and rather than turn back, they simply waved their wands and made a bridge of stone appear across the treacherous water, and they began to walk across it, pleased with their own cleverness. When they had reached the very middle of the bridge, however, they found a hooded figure standing in their path, blocking their way, and the figure was Death himself. In the story, Death was cheated, and Death did not like to be cheated. He had been expecting to gather these 3 travelers into his cold company at that river, for the water had claimed so many before them, and now they had crossed it alive by their own skill. Yet Death was cunning, and he was patient, and he pretended to be full of admiration for the 3 clever brothers. He told them that because they had been so clever, they had each earned a prize, and he offered to grant each of them whatever he most desired. This is where the story turns, the way a river turns, quietly and with great consequence. because the three brothers each asked for something different, and each of their three wishes tells us something about who they were and about the very different fates that would follow them. The eldest brother was a proud man, a fierce man, a man who loved to win. His name, in the truer history behind the fable, was Antioch, and he was the first of the three, the boldest and the most warlike. He asked death for a wand more powerful than any wand in existence, a wand that would always win its owner every duel he ever fought, a wand fit for a wizard who had conquered death itself. And so from an elder tree growing on the bank of that river Death fashioned such a wand and handed it to the eldest brother. And this became known in whispered legend as the Elder Wand, the Wand of Destiny, the death stick that would be sought and stolen and fought over for centuries to come. The second brother, in the fable a haughty man, and in the truer history a wizard named Cadmus, wanted something else entirely, something more tender and more sorrowful. He wanted to humble death still further, and so he asked for the power to call the dead back from beyond. He was thinking, perhaps, of someone he had loved and lost, someone whose face he could no longer bear to be without. And Death, still smiling his hidden smile, picked up a small stone from the riverbank and gave it to the second brother, telling him it had the power to bring back the dead. This little stone would come to be known as the Resurrection Stone, and it is worth resting on the name Cadmus for a moment as we drift along, because from this second brother would descend, many long generations later, a line that led at last to a dark and lonely wizard the world would come to fear, the one who called himself Lord Voldemort. So it is that the story of the second brother is stitched, though neither of them ever knew it, into the very same tapestry as the story of Harry. But it is the third and youngest brother we must follow most closely tonight, the one whose thread runs straight and clear into the house of Potter. In the tale, he is the humblest of the three, and also the wisest. And in the truer history, his name was Ignotus Peverell. Ignotus did not trust death for a moment. He did not ask for a weapon, and he did not ask to conquer grief. Instead, being modest and careful and clever in a gentler way than his brothers, he asked for something that would let him leave that place without death being able to follow him. And so he asked for an invisibility cloak, a cloak so complete and so perfect that even death himself would not be able to see the wearer beneath it. Reluctantly, for it was his own cloak that hid him, Death took off his cloak of invisibility and handed it over to the youngest brother, and the three men parted and went their separate ways. The fable then tells us what became of each of them. The eldest brother, boastful with his unbeatable wand, was murdered in his sleep by a rival who coveted its power, and so Death took the first brother. The second brother, using the little stone to summon back the one he had loved, found that she returned to him cold and sad and out of place among the living, a shadow and not truly herself, until his grief grew so unbearable that he took his own life to join her, and so Death took the second brother too. But the third brother, wise Ignotus, wrapped himself in his cloak of invisibility and walked through the world unseen for a very long and full life, and Death searched for him for many years and never once found him. Only when Ignotus had grown old, when he was ready, did he take the cloak off at last and hand it down to his own son, and then he greeted Death as an old friend, and the two of them departed this life together as equals. And here is the quiet marvel of it, the thing that turns a bedtime fable into a family history, because that cloak was real, and it was never lost, and it never wore out the way ordinary enchanted cloaks fade and fray with the years. It passed from Ignotus Peverell to his son, and from that son onward, down through the generations of the Peverell line, always handed from parent to child, always kept safe a treasure passed along quietly like a family name. And in the fullness of time the Peverell line would flow, through the marriage of a Peverell granddaughter, into a young and prosperous healing family, straight into the house of Potter, so that the cloak of the third brother would become, in the end, the cloak of Harry. So let us hold this thought as we drift on, that the oldest story of all, the little tale told to sleepy wizarding children in the dark, was quietly also the truest story of Harry's own family, the record of an inheritance far older and stranger than gold. The Peverell brothers were not invented for a fable. They lived, and they left things behind, and one of those things was a plain silvery cloak that would come to rest, centuries later, in the hands of an orphaned boy who never knew, at first, how very much he had been given. Of the three brothers who met the shrouded figure at the middle of that lonely bridge, it is the youngest who lingers most softly in the mind, and it is his story, more than either of the others, that reaches all the way down the long, slow river of the years and touches the family whose fortune we are wandering through tonight. The oldest brother, you will remember, had asked for a wand that could win any duel, and the second brother had asked for the power to call the dead back from beyond the veil, and both of those gifts, so bright and so tempting, had led them by short and bitter roads to ruin. But the third and youngest brother, whose name the old tale gives to us as Gringotts Peverell, looked at the tall, dark shape before him and understood something that his brothers, in their hunger and their grief, had not paused to understand. And what he understood was that the figure on the bridge was not a friend to be flattered and not a servant to be commanded, but a patient and inevitable thing that would one day come for each of them, no matter how clever their bargains were. And so, being the humblest of the three and by far the most careful, Gringotts did not ask for power over others, and he did not ask for a way to cheat the grave of those he loved, but instead he asked, very quietly, for something that would let him leave that place without the tall figure following him, something that would let him walk on through the years unseen, so that not even the eyes of that shrouded watcher could find him until the proper and appointed hour had come. What he asked for, in other words, was a cloak of true and lasting invisibility, one woven not from the thin, fading enchantments that ordinary wizards might lay upon ordinary cloth, but from a deeper and older magic that would not wear away. And the figure on the bridge, perhaps a little surprised, and perhaps a little pleased, drew off its own covering and handed it to the youngest brother, and Gringotts wrapped himself within it and walked away into the wide green country, beyond, hidden and safe and quiet. Now here is the tender heart of the whole matter, the part that makes this brother different from the two who came before him, for while the eldest was murdered in his sleep for the wand he had boasted of, and while the second took his own life in his longing for a love that could not truly return, the youngest brother did none of these things and suffered none of these fates, and instead he lived. He lived on for many long and ordinary years beneath the shelter of his cloak, growing older and grayer and gentler as the seasons turned around him, keeping himself hidden from death not out of cowardice, for it was never that, but simply because the time was not yet right, and he understood, as his brothers had not, that there is a season for everything, and that a life is not made richer by being clutched at in fear, but by being lived through with patience and with quiet. And when at last the many years had done their work, and the youngest brother had grown very old indeed, old enough to see his own children grown, and his own grandchildren playing at his feet, he came at last to the ending that all of us must come to, and he met it in a way so calm and so unafraid that the old story has treasured the memory of it ever since. For Gringotts, when he felt that his time had truly arrived, did not run and did not hide any longer, but instead he lifted the cloak from his own shoulders after all those years of shelter beneath it. And he handed it down to his son so that it might pass on into the keeping of the family and go on sheltering those who came after him. And then, having given away the one gift that had kept him hidden for so long, he turned to greet the tall figure he had eluded for a lifetime. And the tale tells us that he greeted that figure not as an enemy and not as a terror, but as an old and familiar friend. And that the two of them departed together, side by side and equal at the last, as gladly as two companions setting out upon a journey they had long meant to take. There is a great and quiet wisdom folded into that image, and it is worth resting upon for a moment in the hush of the evening, because it tells us what the youngest brother's cloak was really for. It was never a trophy, as the wand had been for the eldest, and it was never a doorway back to the dead, as the stone had been for the second. It was, in the plainest sense, a way of walking safely and gently through a whole long life, a shelter rather than a weapon, a soft gray mercy rather than a sharp and dangerous power. And this is why so many who have loved this old story have called the cloak the truest of the three gifts and the gentlest and the wisest of them all. The wand invited its owners to fight and to die fighting, and the stone invited its owners to grieve until grief consumed them. But the cloak asked only that its owner live quietly and live well. And then, when the proper hour arrived, lay the gift aside and step forward without fear. And when the very oldest tellers of this story wished to understand who the tall shrouded figure had truly been, and what those three gifts had truly meant, some of the wisest among them came at last to a beautiful and comforting conclusion, which is that the three brothers had not really met death upon a bridge at all, in the way a child first hears it, but had instead been three uncommonly gifted brothers who each shaped an object of astonishing and dangerous magic, and that the tale had wrapped their cleverness in the soft cloak of legend, the way a grandmother wraps a hard truth in a bedtime story. In that gentler reading, the eldest brother made an unbeatable wand and was killed for it, and the second made a stone that could seem to summon the dead and was undone by his own longing, and the youngest, the modest one, simply made a cloak so wonderfully hidden and so lasting that it kept him and his descendants safe for centuries, and lived quietly and died in his own good time as an old and contented man. Either way you choose to hear it, whether as a meeting upon a misty bridge or as the story of three brothers and the marvels they made, the meaning that settles over the youngest of them is the same, and it is a soft and reassuring meaning to carry into sleep. Ignotus Peverell was the brother who wanted nothing more than to live his life fully and to shelter those he loved. And because he wanted so little for himself, he was given the one gift that could be passed down through the generations, without curse and without sorrow. A gift that would go on protecting his children and his children's children long after he himself had walked away into the quiet. And it is precisely this gift, this humble and lasting and gentle cloak, born of the wisest brother's patience, that will one day drift down through the long branching centuries of a family we have only just begun to know, until it comes to rest in the keeping of a boy asleep in a cupboard, a boy who has no idea yet of the ancient and tender inheritance that is already, quietly, on its way to him. For the cloak did not stay among the Peverells forever, and how it made its slow and gentle passage into the house of Potter is a story all of its own, waiting softly just a little further along the river of the night. So far, we have followed two rivers of good fortune, and now we come to the quiet valley where they meet and become one. The first river is the one that begins with Linfred of Stinchcombe, the gentle healer whose remedies filled the family coffers with honest gold and left his children with land and comfort and a name that the villagers had given him with affection. The second river is the one that begins with Ignotus Peverell, the youngest and wisest of 3 brothers, the one who asked death for something the others never thought to want, a cloak that could hide a living man from the sight of anything that hunted him. And the place where these 2 rivers came together, softly, without trumpets, without any grand ceremony that history bothered to record, was a marriage between one grandchild of Linfred and one grandchild of Ignotus. So that from that day forward, the wealth of the healer and the wonder of the cloak flowed side by side down a single family line, all the way to a small boy sleeping in a cupboard many centuries later. Let us settle into the shape of it slowly, the way you might settle deeper into your pillow. Linfred, you will remember, had many children, and he divided among them the gold and the land he had gathered through his long life of quiet healing. The eldest of his sons was a young man named Hardwin Potter, and it is with Hardwin that the family name begins to travel forward through the ages as a proper family, rather than as one kindly old man in one small village. Hardwin was of the first true generation to carry the name Potter into the wider world, the son who inherited the largest share of his father's careful legacy, the heir of the healer. He grew up in a house where medicine simmered gently on the fire, where the smell of crushed herbs and warm potion was as ordinary as the smell of bread, and where money was never spoken of harshly, because there was always enough of it, and it had always come from doing good. And into that comfortable, herb-scented world came a young woman named Iolantha Peverell. She was the granddaughter of Ignotus, the 3rd brother, the one who had walked away from death and lived to a great age and greeted the end at last as an old friend. Through her veins ran the blood of the Peverells, that ancient and half-legendary family whose name was already whispered in connection with the oldest and strangest story in the wizarding world. But Iolantha did not arrive at the house of Potter carrying only a famous surname and a long and shadowy pedigree. She carried something far more remarkable, folded quietly among her belongings, something that had been handed down to her, parent to child, from Ignotus himself. She carried the cloak. For that was the way of Ignotus, and the way he had asked his descendants to remember him. He had not hidden the cloak away in a vault, or buried it in the earth, or sold it for a fortune of gold. Though a fortune of gold it could certainly have fetched from the right and reckless buyer. He had used it gently through his long life, and then, when his time drew near, he had passed it to his child, as an ordinary father passes an ordinary heirloom. A watch, a ring, a good warm coat for the winters to come. And that child had passed it onward in turn, and so the cloak had come down through the generations of the Peverell line until it reached Iolantha, a young woman about to be married, carrying in her keeping one of the 3 deathly hollows, without, perhaps, always thinking of it in such grand and dangerous terms at all. When Iolantha Peverell married Hardwin Potter, the cloak of invisibility passed, softly and permanently, into the house of Potter. There was no theft in it, no trickery, no curse laid upon the giving. It came as a wedding brings things together, by love and by the joining of 2 families, and once it had crossed that threshold, it never left. The healer's line and the Peverell line were now a single family, and that family owned, without quite advertising the fact, the most perfect object of concealment ever made. From that moment, the treasure of the Potters was no longer only the gold in their chests and the land beneath their feet. It was also a soft, silvery weight of cloth that never wore thin, never frayed, never faded, and never lost the strange, deep magic sewn into its threads. And here is the tender heart of it, the part that makes this inheritance so different from every other inheritance in this long story. Gold can be spent, and land can be sold, and even a great house can pass out of a family's hands in a single hard generation. But the cloak was handed down in a way that gold rarely is, from parent to child, in an unbroken chain that stretched across the centuries like a single thread pulled taut through time. Each potter who held it seems to have understood, however dimly, that it was not merely a useful thing, but a trust, a piece of the family itself. And so each one kept it and cherished it and gave it, when the time came, into the hands of the next. Iolanthe to her child, that child to the one who followed, on and on and on, through names that history has mostly forgotten, through quiet lives and comfortable houses, through the long, unremarkable centuries of an old and easy family. There is a small and touching detail that has come down to us about Iolanthe herself, which shows how deeply she felt the weight of what she carried. It is said that she was distressed that her husband wished to speak openly of the cloak, to boast a little, perhaps, as young men will, of the wondrous thing his bride had brought into his home. But Iolanthe held to the older wisdom of her family, the quiet Peverell instinct that such a treasure is best kept close and spoken of softly, that its power lies partly in the fact that so few know it exists at all. And so the cloak remained a family secret, a hidden inheritance, moving from one generation to the next beneath ordinary robes and ordinary lives, never displayed, never sold, never surrendered. Follow that thread forward now, gently, as far as it will go, and you will find where it ends, or rather where it arrives, for a thread like this does not truly end. Down through the long generations the cloak traveled, from Hardwin and Iolanthe onward, until it came at last into the keeping of a man named James Potter, a young man who wore it to slip through his school by night on small and grinning adventures, never fully knowing what an ancient and extraordinary thing lay across his shoulders. And James, in the way of all the potters before him, meant to pass it to his own son when the time was right. That time came far too soon, and in far too much sorrow, but the cloak was kept safe even then. And in the end, it did reach the child it was always meant for. It came down to a boy named Harry, the last of the long line, the newest hand in a chain of hands reaching all the way back to a grandmother named Iolanthe, and, beyond her, to the third brother who once walked away from death itself. So when we ask why the Potters were rich, we must remember that some of their wealth was never counted in gold at all. Some of it was a soft gray weight of cloth, folded quietly and given in love from parent to child across the turning of the centuries, the oldest and most precious thing the family owned, carried faithfully down the years until it settled at last upon the shoulders of a sleeping, orphaned boy who did not yet know how far back his good fortune truly reached. Rest now, and let that thread run gently through your thoughts, unbroken and softly shining all the way home. There is a curious thing to notice about the Potters, and it is the sort of thing that is easy to miss when you are only thinking about gold, and it is this, that for all their age and all their comfort, for all the centuries of quiet standing that lay behind them, they were never counted among the families that the wizarding world liked to call truly pure of blood. You might expect that a house as old as theirs, a house descended from a beloved medieval healer and joined by marriage to the ancient line of the Peverells, would sit near the very top of any list of the oldest and grandest wizarding families, and in a sense it deserved to. And yet when such a list was actually written down, the Potters were left off it entirely. And to understand why is to understand something gentle and important about the kind of family they had chosen over long years to be. The list in question came to be known as the Sacred 28, and it was drawn up in the early 1930s by an author who wished to record the wizarding families of Britain. that he believed had remained wholly pure, meaning families in which, as far as anyone could tell, no witch or wizard had ever married a Muggle or a Muggle born, so that the magic ran on unbroken through every branch. 28 names were chosen, and among them were houses whose names you may already half remember: the Malfoys and the Blacks, the Lestranges and the Knotts, the Gaunts far in their decline, and the Weasleys too, poor and cheerful and pure, all at once. It was a list that some proud families treasured like a jewel and hung upon in conversation, and it was a list that quietly wounded and quietly excluded a great many others. And one of the names that did not appear upon it, one of the names left out on purpose, was the name of Potter. Now, the reason the Potters were left off was not that they were too young, for they were older than many who made the cut. And it was not that they were too poor or too obscure, for they were neither. And it was not that anyone doubted their magic, for their magic was famous and old and true. The reason was far simpler and far kinder than any of those, and it was that the Potters had never bothered, across all their long generations, to keep their blood so-called pure. They had married whom they loved. They had welcomed witches and wizards born to Muggle parents into their family without a second thought, and they had let their children marry outside the small circle of ancient houses whenever the heart pointed that way. And because of this, the compilers of the list looked at the Potters and decided, rather sniffily, that they simply could not be included, because somewhere back along the line, the pure thread had been happily and willingly broken. And here is a thing worth resting on for a moment, softly, as the night settles. The very same openness that got the Potters struck from that proud list is the openness that tells you where their fortune did not come from. Because if a family builds its standing on blood, on keeping the line closed and narrow and unmixed, then it comes to believe that its worth is a thing carried in the veins, a thing that must be guarded and never shared. But the Potters never believed that. Their gold had come from a healer who mended his neighbors, and from remedies sold to whoever needed them, and it would one day come from an invention offered to the whole world, and none of that had anything to do with the purity of anyone's ancestry. So when the fashionable families whispered that the Potters had let themselves down by mixing their blood, the Potters, one imagines, went on being wealthy and well-liked all the same, because their money had never rested on the thing they were being scolded for setting aside. There was, of course, a name for families like the Potters, a name that certain proud households used with a curl of the lip, and that name was blood traitor. It was a phrase meant to sting, a phrase for any pure-blooded witch or wizard who did not think themselves better than those born to Muggle parents. Any family that treated Muggle-borns as equals and friends and worthy husbands and wives. To the sort of person who cared deeply about such things, to a Black of the old severe kind, or a Malfoy nursing his pride, the Potters were exactly this: a fine old family who ought to have known their place at the top and instead kept lowering the drawbridge and letting everyone in. And so the Potters were murmured about in some circles as traitors to their own blood, tolerant to a fault, too fond of Muggles and Muggle-borns for their own good. And this reputation followed the family quietly for generations before it ever touched the boy who would carry the name into the darkest years. Yet you must not imagine that being left off the list left the Potters small or sad or unwelcome. They were, if anything, respected all the more by those whose respect was worth having. They were an ancient family, and a comfortable one, known and greeted and trusted. And their exclusion from the Sacred 28 was a badge that a wiser soul might wear with quiet pride rather than shame. For the list itself was a foolish and rather cruel little document when you looked at it closely, so eager to exclude that it left out real pure blood families it simply disliked, and so blind to the future that had enshrined the Gaunts, who were sinking into madness and poverty even as the ink dried. To be absent from such a list was, in the end, no loss at all, and perhaps it was a kind of honor. The honor of a family that had let love and kindness matter more than the cold accounting of ancestry. And this openness ran all the way down to the last of them. Think of James Potter, the heir to all that old money, who might have chosen, had he cared for such things, a bride from one of the grand pure blood houses to keep the line respectable in the eyes of the proud. Instead, he loved and married Lily Evans, a witch born to Muggle parents, a Muggle born. The very sort of person the fashionable families sneered at, and in doing so James did nothing new at all, for he was only carrying on the oldest habit of his house, the habit of choosing the heart over the bloodline. So the boy who would inherit the vault at Gringotts, the boy asleep in his cradle at Godric's Hollow, was himself the living proof of everything the Potters had always been, half from an ancient wizarding line and half from a Muggle-born mother, and rich all the same, and loved all the same, and none of it undone by the mixing. So when you wonder why the Potters had so much, remember also this quieter answer that sits beneath the gold. Their fortune was never a reward for keeping their blood pure, because they never kept it pure, and they were never meant to be on the list of those who did. Their wealth grew instead in a house that opened its doors, that married for love and healed for kindness, and invented for the good of all. And if some proud families thought that made the Potters lesser, the long and comfortable centuries of the family suggest, very gently, that the proud families were wrong. The money came from care and cleverness and welcome, and never once from the narrow pride of blood. And there is something deeply restful in knowing that. Something worth carrying softly with you now, as the story drifts on toward the quieter centuries still to come. Between the age of Linfred, the gentle healer of Stinchcombe, and the age of the grandfather who would one day make the family truly rich, there stretched a great and unhurried span of years. And it is worth resting there for a while, in those long, quiet centuries when very little seemed to happen to the Potters at all, because in many ways that quietness is itself the answer to the question we keep circling around, the question of why this family was so comfortable, so settled, so gently and durably well off. For the truth is that the Potters spent hundreds of years doing something that is far harder than it sounds, and far rarer than we tend to imagine, which is simply keeping what they had, tending it, passing it on unbroken, and never once gambling it away on pride or ambition or the sort of grand and glittering schemes that undo so many old houses. Picture, if you will, the shape of those generations, one after another, like a long row of candles set out on a windowsill, each one lit from the flame of the last. There was Hardwin, the eldest son of Linfred, who married the granddaughter of Ignotus Peverell, and so brought the silver cloak beneath the family roof. And after Hardwin there came his children, and after them their children. Names half remembered now, and mostly lost to the ordinary forgetting that swallows all but the loudest families, and yet each of them living out a life much like the one before, on the same soft green land, drawing on the same steady vault of gold, sleeping under the same inherited roof beams, and carrying forward the same quiet good name that Linfred had first earned by kindness so many years ago. They were, in the way of the wizarding world, something very like the old landed gentry of the countryside beyond their hedgerows. The sort of family that owns its acres outright and owes no one anything, that has held the same house for so long that no living person can quite remember a time before it, and that measures its wealth not in any sudden fortune, but in permanence, in the simple, unremarkable fact of always having been there, and always expecting to be. Their gold sat in the deep cold vaults of Gringotts, gathered coin by coin across the generations, and their land lay soft and productive under English skies, and neither the gold nor the land was ever the sort of thing they talked about, because to talk about it would have been to treat it as a surprise. And it was never a surprise to them, it was only home. There is a particular kind of comfort in old money that is very different from the sharp, bright excitement of new riches, and the Potters had it in full. They did not need to prove anything to anyone. They had no burning wish to sit at the highest tables of wizarding society, no craving to be counted among the proud and the fashionable, no hunger to see their name carved into the walls of the ministry or whispered with awe at grand and glittering parties. They were content, in a way that the truly ambitious can never quite understand, to be respected without being envied, to be liked without being feared, and to live well and privately behind their own quiet hedges, while louder families rose and fell and rose again, out in the wide and gossiping world. And so, century followed century, in that gentle, unbroken rhythm. Kings came and went in the Muggle world beyond the family's fields, and wars were fought and forgotten, and the great wheel of history turned through plague and plenty, and the slow rebuilding of the land, and through all of it, the Potters simply carried on, healers and homebodies, and careful keepers of what they had been given, marrying for affection more often than for advantage, raising their children in the old warm rooms, and handing down, along with the gold and the acres, two things far more precious than either. The first of those two things was the good name itself, that quiet reputation for decency and skill that Linfred had planted and that every generation since had watered by simply being kind, so that to be a Potter meant, in the small and knowing circles that remembered such things, to be trustworthy, to be gentle, to be the sort of person a frightened neighbor might come to in the dark hours of need. The second thing they handed down, folded away in some cedar chest or wrapped in soft cloth at the bottom of a family cupboard, was the cloak, the strange and shimmering cloak of the third Peverell brother, passed from parent to child across all those long years as faithfully as the gold itself, and perhaps more faithfully, because gold can be spent and land can be sold, but the cloak was never sold, and never spent, and never let go. It traveled quietly down the family line like a secret kept warm through the winters, and though most of the Potters who owned it across those centuries could not have told you the whole strange tale of where it came from, they knew it was old, and they knew it was theirs, and they knew, in the wordless way that families know such things, that it was to be guarded and treasured and passed onward when their own time came to lay it down. If you had wandered, in any one of those hundreds of years, up the lane toward wherever the Potters happened to be living, you would most likely have found nothing at all to catch the eye, and that was rather the point. There would have been a solid and unshowy house, older than its neighbors and better kept, with smoke rising gently from the chimneys, and a garden thick with herbs and healing plants grown from cuttings that had been in the family since Linfred first pressed them into the soil. There would have been a warm kitchen and shelves of labeled jars and bottles, and somewhere in the deeper rooms a shelf of old ledgers recording, in the careful hands of one generation after another, exactly what had been earned and what had been kept. For these were people who counted quietly and wasted little. You would have been offered a seat by the fire and a cup of something warm, and you would have gone away thinking, if you thought of them at all, that here was a pleasant, ordinary, comfortable sort of family, which is precisely what they wished you to think, and precisely, in the truest sense, what they were. It would be easy, looking back across all that untroubled stillness, to imagine that nothing of value was happening, that these were empty and uneventful years, mere waiting between the interesting parts of the story. But that would be a mistake, and a very human one. For the comfort that Harry Potter would one day inherit The deep, secure comfort of a boy who never had to worry about money was not built in any single dramatic moment. It was built here, in the patience of these forgotten generations, in the thousand small acts of not spending, not boasting, not risking, not squandering, in the steady, undemonstrative discipline of a family that knew how to hold. A fortune, after all, is not only made, it must also be kept, and the keeping is the longer labor by far, spread out across lifetimes, done by people whose names we will never learn. So the Potters went on being what they had long been, a comfortable old family living quietly on inherited land and inherited gold, respected in their corner of the wizarding world and untroubled by the need to be anything grander, tending their fields and their remedies and their good name and their silver cloak through century upon gentle century. And all the while, though none of them could have guessed it, the great sleeping fortune they guarded was waiting, patient as a seed under snow, for the one particular grandchild who would come along near the very end of that long line and, almost by accident, cause it to bloom into something 4 times as large as anything his careful ancestors had ever dreamed. But that is a tale for a little later on. For now it is enough to rest here, in the long quiet years, and to let the old house stand warm and safe in the dark, its gold below, and its cloak within, and its good name over all, waiting without hurry for the morning still to come. And so we come at last, after all those long and quiet centuries, to a single household near the turning of the 20th century into its later years, to a warm and lamplit home in which 2 people lived out most of their lives together, growing older side by side, and where in time a very famous baby would first learn to walk and to laugh, to understand where Harry's gold truly came from, and to understand the man who would one day change the family's fortunes forever. We must first sit for a while with his grandparents, with a gentle and good-humored wizard named Fleamont Potter, and with the woman he loved and married, a witch named Euphemia. They are 2 of the most tender figures in this whole long story, and though the world would never fill books about them the way it filled books about their grandson, the 2 of them mattered a great deal, and the comfortable life that Harry was born into rested very quietly upon their shoulders. Fleamont Potter carried an unusual name, and there is a soft little tale folded inside it, the kind of story that families keep and pass along like a warm blanket handed down from bed to bed. His name was not chosen at random, and it was not chosen for its sound alone. He was named after his own great-grandfather on his mother's side, a man who had also been called Fleamont, and the reason the name traveled down to him was a matter of pride and of gentle stubbornness. That earlier Fleamont, the great-grandfather, was the very last person in his own line to carry that surname, and when he died the name would have died with him and been lost entirely to the world, slipping away the way so many old names have slipped away over the centuries. And so, rather than let it vanish, the family gave the name to the child, tucking it in front of the old and steady name of Potter, so that the boy grew up carrying 2 histories at once, one from each side of his family, both of them saved from being forgotten. It is a small thing, and yet it tells you almost everything you need to know about the sort of people the Potters had become by then. People who kept faith with the past, who honored the ones who came before, and who could not bear to let a good and gentle memory fade away for want of a little care. Fleamont grew into a man well suited to that inheritance. By every account that has come down to us, he was clever and quick, a wizard with a lively and inventive mind. But he was also known for something far rarer than cleverness, and that was a genuine and unforced kindness, a warmth that made other people feel safe and welcome in his company. There was, it must be admitted, a spark of temper in him too, a certain fierce and hasty flair when something moved him, and it was often said in later years that his grandson Harry inherited that same untidy shock of jet-black hair that would never lie flat no matter how it was brushed or combed. But the temper was a small thing beside the goodness, a passing weather over a steady and sunlit land, and those who knew him remembered chiefly how easy he was to love, how ready he was to laugh, and how carefully he watched over the people who belonged to him. The woman who came to share his long life was Euphemia, and though the records that survive about her are few and soft-edged, everything we do know points in the same warm direction. She and Fleamont were, by the standards of the wizarding world, and by the standards of any world at all, a devoted and contented couple. Two people who had found in one another a lasting companionship, the kind that deepens rather than fades across the slow passing of the decades. Together they kept the old Potter household, an ancient and comfortable family home, well settled and free of want, resting upon the gold and the good name that Linfred the Healer had first gathered so many hundreds of years before, and that so many careful generations had tended and preserved. They were not, at this point in the story, extraordinarily rich in the way the greatest families were rich. They were something gentler and steadier than that. They were secure. They were at ease. They had enough, and a little more than enough, and they had never in their lives had to fear the cold arithmetic of not having quite enough, and that quiet security was itself a kind of inheritance, handed down as surely as any vault of coins. And yet, for all their comfort and all their love, there was one soft sorrow that lay across the middle of their marriage like a shadow across a warm afternoon, and it was this. For many long years, Fleamont and Euphemia had no child. They had married, and they had built their life, and they had hoped, the way people hope in the private hours of the evening, and still no child had come to them. The years went on, and turned them slowly from a young couple into a settled middle-aged one, and then into a couple growing genuinely old. And by every ordinary reckoning of the world, they had begun to give up the dream entirely, to fold it gently away, and make their peace with a quiet house that would only ever hold the two of them. It is one of the tenderest facts in this whole tale that the parents of James Potter were by then well past the age when most people expect to become parents at all, and that they had waited and longed and very nearly stopped longing before their wish was answered. But their wish was answered. Late in their lives, far later than they had ever dared to count upon, a son was born to them, and they named him James. You can only imagine, sitting here in the soft dark, what that arrival must have meant to two people who had waited so very long, who had almost taught themselves not to want it any longer. James Potter was, in the truest and fullest sense, a cherished and long-awaited child, born to older parents who had every reason in the world to treasure him, and treasure him they did. He grew up as the beloved only son of a doting mother and father, in a home that was warm and safe and free from every ordinary worry, wanting for nothing, surrounded by affection and by comfort in equal measure. He was, some might gently say, a little spoiled by all of it, a boy who had never known hardship and never expected to, and much of the easy confidence he carried through his own short life was planted in that indulgent and adoring household, in the love of two people who had thought their arms would stay empty and found them full at last. So here is the household from which Harry's own father set out into the world, a house of an ancient family that was already comfortable, already secure, already gilded softly by the labors of the long-dead healer and by the careful thrift of 100 quiet generations. And here is the man, Fleamont Potter, sitting at the center of it, clever and kind and quick of temper and slow of grudge. A father who adored his boy, and a wizard whose lively and inventive mind was even then, in those very years, turning over an idea. A small and unlikely idea. An ordinary sort of everyday problem that no one had ever quite solved. He did not yet know it, and neither did Euphemia, and neither did anyone in all the wizarding world. But that one idea, worked out patiently in a home that already had plenty, was about to take the steady, comfortable wealth of the Potters and multiply it far beyond anything that Linfred himself had ever dreamed. For now, though, let it rest there, in the lamplight, with an old man and his wife and the child they had waited a lifetime to hold, safe and warm and loved, on the edge of a fortune not yet made. For all the long centuries we have wandered through so far, the fortune of the Potter family had been a gentle, steady sort of wealth, the kind that gathers slowly like snow on a still night, one soft layer settling upon another. The healing coins of Linfred passed down through Hardwin and Iolanthe, and the many quiet generations who came after them, so that by the time we arrive at Fleamont Potter, the family was already comfortable, already old, already respected, already the owner of a fine house and a vault at Gringotts that never ran dry. And yet, the truly remarkable leap, the moment when comfortable became genuinely rich, when a well-cushioned old family became a family whose gold multiplied like water pouring into a deep and shining basin, did not come from an inheritance at all. And it did not come from a dragon hoard or a buried treasure or a stroke of luck at the Goblin Bank. It came, of all the tender and unexpected things in the world, from hair. From ordinary, unruly, disobedient hair, and from a clever man who decided that he could tame it. Fleamont Potter, the grandfather of Harry, the father of James, was by every account a warm and industrious soul, and somewhere in the middle years of his life he turned his mind toward a small and very human problem that had troubled witches and wizards for as long as there had been mirrors. Hair, you see, does not always do what its owner wishes. It rises and it frizzes, it curls when it is asked to lie flat, it stands on end in the damp and the wind, it refuses to be smooth no matter how patiently it is brushed. And in a world full of powerful magic there had never quite been a simple, reliable, everyday remedy for the plain nuisance of a head of hair that would not behave. Fleamont, being a potter, and being descended from a long line of tinkerers and healers who had never been able to resist mixing one more careful potion, set himself to the task, and after who knows how many quiet evenings bent over a warm cauldron, measuring and stirring and testing and beginning all over again, he brewed something wonderful. He called it Sleekeazy's Hair Potion, and the name itself tells you exactly what it promised. For it made the hair sleek, and it made the smoothing of it easy, and that was the whole gentle genius of the thing. It was, in the simplest terms, a sleekness charm captured inside a bottle, a little measure of tidy, obedient magic that anyone at all could pour into the palm of a hand and work through their hair, so that the frizz lay down and the tangles loosened and the whole rebellious mane settled into something smooth and glossy and neat. There was no wand required and no incantation to remember, no skill and no training. Only the small pleasure of opening a bottle and letting the potion do its patient work. And that, more than anything, is why it spread so far and so fast, because it asked nothing of the person using it except the wish to look a little tidier than before. And spread it did. Sleekeazy's hair potion became, quite simply, a runaway success. The kind of success that a modest inventor can scarcely imagine when he first corks his experimental little vials. Bottles of it traveled from shop to shop and from village to town, from one witch who swore by it to another who had only heard it praised, until it seemed that half the wizarding world kept a bottle of Sleekeazy's somewhere within easy reach, tucked upon a bathroom shelf or packed into a traveling bag, ready for any morning when the hair simply would not cooperate. It was useful, it was affordable, it was pleasant, and above all it was needed, day after day and year after year, by ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. And there is no surer foundation for a fortune than a small, honest thing that a great many people wish to buy again and again. The gold, as you might imagine, came flowing in. The chronicles of the family tell us plainly that the invention of Sleekeazy's hair potion quadrupled the potter gold, and it is worth pausing on that word for a long, slow moment, because to quadruple a fortune is to multiply it 4 times over. To take a vault that was already deep and heavy with the accumulated coin of many centuries, and to fill it 4 times as full. The healing remedies of Linfred had begun the family's wealth, and the marriages and inheritances of the years between had preserved it. But it was this one lucky, clever, wonderfully unglamorous potion, this little bottle of tamed and tidy hair, that lifted the potters from merely comfortable to truly and unmistakably rich. And that is the quiet heart of the whole long answer we have been circling. The reason the boy in the story would one day find his vault so improbably full of gold. Fleamont did not spend the rest of his days chained to his cauldrons, forever brewing to keep the fortune flowing. When at last he grew older and wished to rest, he did the sensible and satisfying thing, which was to sell the company he had built, to hand over Sleekeazy's hair potion and all its bottles and its recipes and its faithful customers to new owners in exchange for a very great deal of money. And so he retired, wealthy and content, his fortune settled and secure, and ready to be passed along to the son he and Euphemia had welcomed so late and so gladly into their lives. This is the gold that James Potter would inherit, the gold that would let a young man live his whole life without ever once needing to work for his living, and it all traced back, in the end, to a bottle of hair potion, and to a grandfather clever enough to bottle a little order and sell it to a world in need of tidying. There is one last detail about Sleekeazy's that is far too charming to leave unspoken. A small and glittering thread that reaches all the way forward into a story you may already know, for the potion did not fade from the world when Fleamont sold his company. It went on selling and smoothing and soothing frizzy hair for generations after him, and so it was that, many years later, on the evening of a great winter ball held within the castle at Hogwarts, a certain clever young witch named Hermione Granger reached for a bottle of Sleekeazy's hair potion to prepare herself for the dance. Her own hair had always been famously bushy and untamable, the despair of every brush, and for one special night she smoothed it sleek and elegant with a potion invented long ago by the grandfather of her dear friend Harry, though neither she nor Harry could possibly have known. As she descended the stairs looking so unexpectedly graceful, that the very magic taming her curls had once been the making of the Potter fortune itself. It is one of those small, secret rhymes that the world sometimes keeps hidden inside its own history. A bottle that filled a family's vault with gold in one century, quietly helping a young girl feel beautiful in another. And it ties the whole tale together with a soft and satisfying little knot. So when you find yourself wondering how the parents of one orphaned boy came to leave behind such a startling weight of gold, remember that the answer, at its very center, is not grand or dark or mysterious at all. It is a warm inventor at a cauldron, an ordinary human wish to look a little neater, and a clever, kindly potion that a whole world was glad to buy, quietly filling a deep vault 4 times over, while everyone was simply trying to smooth their hair before bed. And so we come at last to the young man at the very heart of our story, the one whose name, Harry, would carry through every year of his life, the father he never truly knew, and yet resembled so closely in face and in spirit. James Potter was born late in the lives of his parents, Fleamont and Euphemia, who had wanted a child for many long years and had almost given up hope of ever holding one. When at last he arrived, he came into a home that was already gentle, already prosperous, already warm with the quiet comfort that generations of potters had built up slowly and carefully across the centuries. He was, from the very first breath he drew, a fortunate boy, and it is worth pausing here in the hush of the evening to think about exactly what that fortune meant and what it did not. By the time James was born, his father Fleamont had already invented the hair potion that made the family wealthy beyond anything their ancestors had known. The smooth and clever little remedy that had quadrupled the gold already resting in their vaults. The company had been sold, the profit gathered in, and Fleamont had settled into a rich and easy retirement with more galleons than a family could reasonably spend in several lifetimes. Into that soft cushion of security, James was set down as a much longed for and much adored only son, cherished by two older parents who had waited so patiently for him and who were determined to give him everything that love and money together could provide. He grew up indulged, it is fair to say, wrapped in the kind of ease that most children in the wizarding world could only imagine, never once wondering where the next meal might come from or whether the fire would be lit in winter. There is a softness to a childhood like that, and there is a danger in it too, and the tales tell us honestly that James carried a little of both into his younger years. He was confident to the point of arrogance when he was a schoolboy, sure of himself, quick with his wand, quicker still with his laughter, a young man who had never once been told no by the world, and who had rarely had to bite his tongue or bend his pride. Money can do that to a person, especially money that arrives already made, already waiting, needing nothing from the one who inherits it but the willingness to enjoy it. James had that willingness in full, and in his early years at Hogwarts, he could be careless with the feelings of others, showing off, playing at being the brightest star in every room he entered, because he had never had a single reason to doubt that he was. And yet, the same comfort that made him proud also made him generous, for these two things grow from the same root far more often than we like to admit. A boy who has never gone without finds it easy to give, and James gave freely, of his time, of his loyalty, of his gold, of his fierce and open heart. His friends never wanted for anything when James was near, and the deep bonds he formed in his school days, the friendships that would define the rest of his short life, were held together in part by the sheer warmth of a young man who had so much and was so happy to share it. He was brave, he was loyal, he was funny, and beneath the swagger of a boy who had been given everything there was, slowly and steadily, a good and decent man taking shape. It is important to say plainly, in the calm honesty of this quiet hour, that James Potter never needed to work a day in his life to keep bread on the table. The inheritance that came down to him, the fortune of Linfred and Hardwin, the gold multiplied by Fleamont, the rare and secret treasures folded into the family for 1,000 years, all of it meant that James could have chosen simply to rest. He could have lived the whole span of his years in comfortable idleness, drifting from one pleasant day to the next, never lifting a finger toward any purpose greater than his own amusement. Many a young man with so much gold behind him has done exactly that, has let the years slip softly by in ease and pleasure, and no one would truly have blamed James if he had chosen the same. But that is not what he chose, and here is where the story turns and where the light in it grows warmer. For James Potter came of age in a dark and frightening time, in the years when a terrible wizard was rising and spreading fear across the whole of the magical world. when families whispered behind locked doors, and no one knew quite whom to trust. And into that gathering darkness, this rich young man who owed the world nothing, who could have hidden safely behind the high walls of his fortune and let others do the fighting, stepped forward instead and offered everything he had. He joined a secret circle of brave souls gathered to stand against the darkness, a band of the faithful and the fearless who risked their lives again and again because someone had to and because they could not look away. There is a particular kind of courage in that choice, and it is worth naming softly before we let the thought settle you towards sleep. James did not fight because he was poor and had nothing to lose. He fought precisely because he had everything, every comfort, every safety, every reason in the world to stay quietly at home, and he laid all of it on the line anyway. His freedom from the need to work did not make him lazy or small. It set him free, instead, to give his whole self to something larger than his own life, to pour his days and his energy, and in the end, his very being into the fight against a cruelty he could not abide. The fortune his ancestors had built up over so many centuries became, in his hands, not a wall to hide behind, but a foundation to stand upon, a firm and steady ground from which he could reach out toward the world and try, with everything he was, to make it kinder. He married young, he loved deeply, and he made his home with the woman who would become the mother of his son, the two of them wrapped up together in the same courage and the same devotion to the cause they served. When danger came for them directly, when the darkness turned its attention toward their little family, James did not run and did not bargain. He stayed. He stood between the ones he loved and the thing that hunted them, and he gave the last full measure of everything he had, all the ease and all the plenty, and all the long, comfortable years he might have had, in a single act of love that would echo down through his son's whole life and beyond. So when we picture James Potter, let us not picture only the proud schoolboy or the spoiled heir, though he was those things too, for a while, as many young people are. Let us picture the fuller truth of him, the man who was given a great deal, and who, when the moment came, gave a great deal more in return. The gold in the family vaults was real, and it made his life gentle and his choices free, and there is no shame in that and no need to pretend otherwise. But the deepest wealth James Potter carried was never counted in galleons. It was carried in his loyalty, in his laughter, in his willingness to stand and fight for others when he might have stood aside, and in the love that he handed down, whole and unbroken, to the child he barely had the chance to hold. And on that quiet inheritance, worth so much more than any vault of gold, we will rest for now and let the night grow soft around us. When James Potter married Lily Evans, he brought into their shared life not only the affection that had grown slowly and stubbornly between them across their years at school, but also the long inheritance we have been tracing through these quiet hours, the gold that Linfred had first earned with his gentle remedies, the cloak that had drifted down from the Peverels like a secret passed hand to hand, and the great swelling fortune that Fleamont had conjured from a bottle of hair potion. Lily came from another world entirely, a Muggle household where her father and mother had raised 2 daughters without a single spell between them, where money was earned by ordinary work and counted in ordinary coins. And so the ease of the Potter family must have seemed to her, at least at first, like something out of one of the storybooks she had loved before she ever knew that magic was real. Yet Lily was never a young woman impressed by wealth for its own sake, and part of what made their marriage so tender was that the money mattered to neither of them very much, sitting quietly in the background of their days like a warm hearth in a room where the true light came from somewhere else. They were very young when they married, younger than most couples are, For the war that Lord Voldemort had brought upon the wizarding world made people gather their happiness quickly, before it could be taken from them. James and Lily had both joined the Order of the Phoenix, that small, brave circle of witches and wizards who stood against the rising darkness. And so their love bloomed in a season of danger, all the sweeter for the shadows that pressed against its edges. Because James had never needed to work for his living, because the fortune his father had built meant that no counting house or shop or ministry desk ever claimed his mornings, the two of them were free in a way that few young people are. Free to give themselves wholly to the cause they believed in, and free, when the time came, to make a home together without worrying over rent or wages or the small, anxious arithmetic that troubles so many new households. The home they chose was in the village of Godric's Hollow, a place whose very name carries the weight of centuries, for it was there, according to the oldest tellings, that Godric Gryffindor himself had once lived, one of the 4 great founders of Hogwarts, and it was from him that the little valley took its name. The village was one of those rare and gentle places in Britain where wizarding families lived quietly among Muggle neighbors. The two communities woven together so softly that most of the ordinary folk never suspected the enchantment threaded through the lanes around them. To walk through Godric's Hollow was to walk through the memory of magic itself for the Peverell brothers, those distant ancestors from whom the Potters drew both their blood and their famous cloak, had lived and died in this very country, and in the old churchyard at the heart of the village there stood a worn stone marked with a small triangular sign, the resting place of Ignotus Peverell, the 3rd brother, the one who had greeted death as an old friend and passed his cloak down the long line that ended, at last, with Harry. There was another old wizarding family bound to that same village, for the Dumbledores had lived there too, and it was in Godric's Hollow that the young Albus had spent the most sorrowful summer of his life. So that when James and Lily settled into their cottage they were, without quite knowing it, taking their place among ghosts and histories far larger than themselves, laying a new and hopeful chapter over pages already crowded with grief and wonder. Their house was a comfortable one, roomy and welcoming, the sort of home that a family fortune makes possible without ever needing to be grand, and it stood at the end of the village where the ordinary world and the hidden one met and mingled. Inside those walls, the young couple built the small daily kingdom that all new parents build, and for a little while it was filled with an ordinary golden contentment. For it was in that cottage, on the last day of July, that their son was born, a dark-haired boy with his mother's bright green eyes, and they named him Harry. Whatever peril waited beyond the garden wall, whatever war still smoldered across the country, inside the house at Godric's Hollow, there was warmth enough and plenty enough to give that child everything a baby could wish for. He wanted for nothing. There was money, of course, resting untouched in the deep vault at Gringotts, but there was so much more than money. For there was a family that had never needed to scramble or worry, parents who could give their whole hearts to the raising of him, and a house soft with the small comforts that love and a little wealth together can provide. One imagines the nursery well furnished and warm, the toys that a fond father would buy, the tiny broomstick that we know James gave his son before that first birthday could ever be reached. A gift of pure delight from a young man who had grown up never once having to ask the price of anything. And here is where the sweetness of the story turns, gently, toward its sorrow, for we know, as they in their happiness could not fully know, how very short this season of quiet plenty was to be. Fleamont and Euphemia, James's own parents, the very grandparents who had built the fortune and who would have doted so completely on the child, had already died before Harry was born, taken not by any dark wizard, but by a wasting illness that came upon them in their old age, And so the boy never knew the gentle inventor whose cleverness had filled the family vault, nor the grandmother whose warmth might have watched over his cradle. The plenty they left behind was real, but the hands that had gathered it were already gone. And James and Lily themselves had only a short while to enjoy the home they had made. For a little more than a year, the cottage at Godric's Hollow held its small, perfect world. A fire in the grate, a baby laughing in the lamplight, two young people who loved each other, and their son with all the fierce tenderness that a war can sharpen. They hid there behind powerful charms, protected by the deepest secrecy their friends could weave around them, hoping against hope that the danger would pass them by. It did not pass them by. On a cold night at the very end of October, the darkness they had spent their short lives resisting came at last to the door of their home, and in the space of a single terrible hour, the warm house fell silent, its two young keepers gone, its only survivor a boy not yet old enough to remember the faces of the parents who had died to keep him safe. So the plenty was cut short. The golden contentment ended almost before it had truly begun. And the great inheritance we have followed through the centuries, the healer's gold and the Peverell cloak, and the fortune spun from a bottle of hair potion, passed in a single stroke to a child who could not yet walk. Everything they had, all the comfort and all the wealth and all the long history behind it, was left to Harry. And yet the one thing they most wished to give him, the thing no vault could hold, was the ordinary quiet life inside those walls. The mornings and the birthdays and the years of being loved beneath that roof. That was the true fortune of Godric's Hollow. And it was the one part of the Potter inheritance that could never be handed down, only mourned and remembered, and carried softly forward in the heart of the boy who lived. To understand what the gold truly meant, you have to remember what the boy had been before he ever set foot inside that bank. Because for the whole of his short life so far, Harry Potter had owned almost nothing at all. He had grown up in the smallest and meanest corner of a house that did not want him, in a cupboard beneath the stairs, where the ceiling sloped so low that he could not stand upright and where spiders kept him company in the dark. His clothes were not his own, but the cast-off and stretched-out garments of his cousin, several sizes too large, faded and soft with the wear of another boy. His glasses were held together with tape because no one had ever thought to buy him a new pair. He had never owned a toy that mattered, never had a room with his name upon the door, never once in 11 years been given a birthday that felt like a celebration rather than an afterthought. He had learned, in the quiet and careful way that unloved children learn, to expect very little, to ask for even less, and to fold himself small so that he would not be noticed and therefore not be blamed. This is the person who walked into Gringotts, and this is why what happened next was so much larger than money. The great white building leaned crookedly over the smaller shops of Diagon Alley, its burnished bronze doors guarded by strange, watchful creatures. And inside, it opened into a vast marble hall where hundreds of goblins sat at long, high counters, weighing gems and writing in enormous ledgers, and paying no more attention to a small boy than they would to a passing drought. Hagrid, the enormous and gentle giant of a man who had come to fetch Harry back into the world he was born to, went up to the counter and explained, in his rumbling and rather bashful way, that they had come to make a withdrawal from the vault belonging to Mr. Harry Potter. There was the matter of the little golden key, which Hagrid produced at last from one of the many deep pockets of his great coat after a good deal of patient searching, a small tarnished thing that had waited all these years to be turned. And so, with a goblin named Griphook to lead them, the two of them were taken down and away from the marble calm of the hall, into the deep places of the earth where the real business of the bank was kept. The journey itself was a wonder to a boy who had never been anywhere. A little cart came clattering along narrow railway tracks, and it carried them plunging down through a maze of twisting passages, past the glow of great underground lakes and the drip of unseen water, past stalactites hanging like teeth from the roof of the tunnels, deeper and deeper into cold, stony darkness, where the air grew chill and old. The cart seemed to know its own way, choosing its turnings without any hand to guide it, rushing them along at a speed that took the breath clean out of Harry's chest. And all the while he clung on and stared, wide-eyed, at a world that had been hidden beneath the ordinary streets his whole life. At last the cart slowed and stopped before a small door set into the rock, and here Griphook stepped down with the little key. The vault was numbered 687, and when the goblin pressed his long finger to the door, and the locks melted away and a great billow of green smoke cleared, Harry saw what waited inside, and for a moment he could not make any sense of it at all. There were mounds of gold coins, heaped and gleaming in the light of Hagrid's lamp, columns of it stacked and spilling and piled against the walls. There were tall towers of silver, and here and there among the silver and the gold lay the smaller heaps of bronze, so that the whole small chamber shone with the soft warm light of 3 metals at once. This was the wizarding money he would soon come to know, the fat golden coins called galleons, the smaller silver ones called sickles, and the little bronze ones called nuts, and there was more of every kind of them than he had ever imagined a single person could possess. It was not the treasure of a king, perhaps, but to a boy who had counted himself lucky to be given a single old coin at Christmas, it might as well have been the whole wealth of the world poured out into one little room beneath the ground. The most extraordinary part, the part that turned the whole ground of his life over like a spade turning soil, was the understanding of who it belonged to. Every coin in that chamber was his. Not borrowed, not lent, not given on sufferance and taken back the moment he was troublesome, but simply and wholly his own, left to him by a mother and a father he could not remember, waiting patiently in the dark all the years he had been told he was a burden and a nuisance, and a boy who cost too much to keep. He had been raised on the story that his parents had been worthless and idle people who had died in a car crash and left him with nothing but the trouble of himself. Now the very earth beneath the bank contradicted that story in gold and silver and bronze. His mother and father had thought of him. They had set something aside for him, somewhere in the years before they died. In a life he could not reach, they had made provision for a son they loved, and that provision had sat here in the deep quiet of Gringotts, undisturbed and unspent, keeping faith with him long after they were gone. Hagrid, kind soul that he was, scooped some of the coins into a small leather bag, enough to buy the boy his books and his robes and his wand, and all the other necessary things of a school he had not known existed until a few days before. And he explained gently which coins were which, so that Harry might begin to learn the shape of the money he had inherited. And it is worth pausing here to notice the tenderness of it, the way the giant took care not to make the boy feel foolish for not knowing, the way he treated the whole business as the most natural thing in the world, as though of course Harry had a vault, of course there was gold with his name upon it, of course he belonged. For a child who had spent his life being made to feel that he did not belong anywhere and to anyone, that quiet assumption was itself a kind of inheritance, worth as much as the coins. Harry did not yet know where this gold had come from, and neither, for a long while, would we. He did not know of the healer who had founded the family many centuries before, nor of the potion that had made the fortune bloom in his grandfather's day, nor of the old and gentle line that had gathered and kept and passed down this wealth across the generations. until it came to rest in a vault with his name upon the key. He only knew, in that first astonished moment, that he was not poor, that he had never truly been poor, that behind the cupboard and the cast-off clothes and the long cold years there had always been this, waiting for him in the dark. It was not the gold itself that changed him, not really, for gold alone changes very little in a heart. It was the knowledge that came riding in upon it, the knowledge that he had been provided for, remembered, and loved before he was old enough to remember anything at all. And with that soft and steadying thought of a small door opening in the deep earth to show a boy that he had never been as alone as he had been taught to believe, we can let the lamplight in the vault grow dim and rest a while, to understand where the gold of the potters truly rested, and how a family could hold a fortune quietly across the long centuries without ever once counting it out upon a kitchen table. You must first come to know the place where nearly all wizarding wealth is kept, a place that sits far below the busy streets of ordinary London, hidden beneath the paving stones and the sewers and the deep old clay, a place called Gringotts. If you were ever to walk down the little crooked lane where the shops of the wizarding world lean together, you would find at the end of it a tall building of snowy white stone, taller than the shops that crowd around it, standing a little askew, as though it were leaning to listen to something no one else could hear. Burnished bronze doors would greet you at the top of a short flight of white steps, and beyond them a second set of doors in softly gleaming silver, and past those a vast marble hall where the light falls gently, and the sound of quills scratching upon parchment is almost the only thing to be heard. And it is here, in this hushed and orderly place, that the fortunes of witches and wizards are guarded with a care that has lasted longer than most kingdoms. Gringotts is run by the goblins, an ancient people, small in stature but sharp of eye and long of memory, clever with metal and stone and numbers in a way that no other folk have ever quite matched. They sit upon high stools behind a great long counter, weighing coins upon little brass scales, examining gemstones through eyeglasses, writing figures into ledgers so old and so heavy that the leather of their covers has grown soft as cloth, and they have kept this bank for so many hundreds of years that the memory of its founding has faded into the gentle mist of long ago. The goblins do not trust easily, and they do not forgive a theft, and it is said and widely believed that to rob Gringotts is very nearly impossible, and for the foolish soul who tries, very nearly the last thing they will ever do. For the deepest chambers are protected by enchantments so old and so strange that even the goblins speak of them only rarely and only quietly. It is this reputation, earned over centuries and never once truly broken, that made the bank the safest place in all the world to leave a family's gold. And so it was that the Potters, like almost every old family, entrusted what they had to the keeping of the goblins beneath the ground. Now the marble hall, grand as it is only the doorway to the true bank, for the vaults themselves lie deep. Deep below, hundreds upon hundreds of feet down into the earth, far beneath the reach of any ordinary spade or drill. And to reach them a visitor does not walk down any staircase, but rides. Beyond a plain wooden door at the edge of the hall waits a maze of narrow stone passageways, lit only by flickering torches set into the rough rock, and along the floor of these passages run little iron rails. And upon the rails sit small carts, and it is in one of these carts that a goblin will take you plunging down into the dark. The carts do not travel gently. They rush and they clatter, and they hurtle around bends and down long, steep slopes, choosing their own path through the twisting tunnels as though they knew the way by heart, which perhaps they do. And cool air streams past your face as you go, and far below you might catch the sound of running water, an underground lake or river passing through caverns older than the city above. Down and down the cart carries you, deeper than any cellar, deeper than any mine, until at last it slows and stops before a small door of rough metal set into the living rock, and this is a vault. Each vault has its number, and each vault its lock, and the smaller vaults belonging to ordinary families are opened simply with a little golden key, the kind that a witch or wizard might carry tucked away safely at home. And when the goblin fits the key and turns it, the door melts away as though it had never been solid at all. And within lies whatever the family has chosen to keep. For most, it is coin, heaped in glittering piles upon the stone floor. More coin than could be spent in an easy lifetime. Mounds of gold and silver and bronze that have been added to across the generations and only rarely drawn down. And the deeper you go, and the older and grander the family, the higher the number of the vault becomes, and the more fearsome its protections grow. For the very oldest and most secret vaults are not opened by any key at all, but only by the touch of a goblin's hand upon the door. And any thief who tried to open such a vault by trickery would find themselves swallowed up and held fast, trapped inside, until the goblins came round to check their locks, which they do only about once in every 10 years. The coins themselves are worth pausing over, for the money of the wizarding world is not the money of the streets above, and it follows a shape all its own that has stayed the same for a very long time. There are 3 coins. The largest and most precious is the galleon, a heavy coin of pure gold, and it is galleons that fill the vaults of the wealthy and galleons that a family such as the Potters would have counted, in their quiet way, as the true measure of their fortune. Below the galleon comes the sickle, a coin of silver, smaller and lighter, worth a modest fraction of the gold above it. And below the sickle again comes the knut, a little coin of bronze, the smallest money there is, the coin you might spend on a single sweet or a folded newspaper. And the way these 3 fit together is charmingly, stubbornly odd, for there are 17 silver sickles in every single gold galleon, and there are 29 bronze nuts in every single silver sickle, which are not round and tidy numbers at all, but crooked ones, the sort of numbers that would make a Muggle accountant frown. And yet the goblins reckon them with perfect ease, their long fingers flicking across the little scales, never once mistaking a sickle for a galleon or losing count of a single nut. So, when you imagine the wealth that Harry's parents left behind, you must picture it in this way. Not as a number written in a bank statement, not as figures glowing upon a screen, but as a real and solid weight of gold resting in the cool, dark far below the earth, guarded by an ancient and untrusting people, reached only by a rushing cart through torchlit tunnels, held safe behind a door that dissolves at the turn of a little golden key. The gold of the Potters lay there in its vault, the same way the gold of 100 old families lay in theirs, patient and undisturbed, growing quietly over the years, as more was added and little was taken. Kept not in a house where it might be stolen or lost, but in the safest place the wizarding world had ever devised. And there is something restful in the thought of it, in the image of all that treasure lying still and silent in the deep, watched over by the goblins and their ledgers, waiting without hurry or worry for the day when the child it belonged to would at last be old enough to be shown the way down. It waited, and it was safe, and no thief and no ruin could reach it there beneath the sleeping city. And knowing that, we can leave the gold in its quiet vault for now, and turn our thoughts gently onward. To understand how strange the fortune of the Potters truly was, it helps to turn now to another old family, one that stood at the very opposite end of everything the Potters became, and to let their story settle softly over you like a heavy blanket on a cold night. This was the House of Gaunt, and it was, by any measure that the proud families of the wizarding world cared about, one of the most ancient and most exalted of them all. The Gaunts could trace their blood back across 1,000 years and more, back to Salazar Slytherin himself, one of the 4 founders of Hogwarts, the wizard whose name was carved into the very stone of the castle, whose emblem was the serpent, and whose memory both frightened and fascinated every witch and wizard who ever heard it. To carry Slytherin's blood was, in the eyes of those who cared for such things, to carry something close to royalty, a lineage so old and so rare that no amount of gold could ever purchase it. And the Gaunts knew this, and clung to it, and let it become the single thing they lived for. And there was more to their inheritance than even that, for the Gaunts were also descended, along another winding branch of the family tree, from Cadmus Peverell, the second of the 3 Peverell brothers whose tale you have already followed through the quiet chapters of this long night. You will remember that it was Ignotus, the youngest and wisest of the 3, whose cloak of invisibility drifted down the centuries into the gentle keeping of the Potters. But Cadmus, the middle brother, the one whose grief was so deep that it undid him, had passed down his own relic, the second of the Deathly Hallows, a plain and ancient ring set with a rough black stone. And so the 2 families, the Potters and the Gaunts, were in truth distant cousins, sprung from the same brothers, joined by the oldest story of all, and yet their paths could not have led to 2 more different endings. For here is the heart of it, the thing worth turning over slowly as you drift toward sleep. The Gaunts had the bloodline. They had the ancestry that the Malfoys and the Blacks would have envied. They had, tucked away in their crumbling little house, 2 objects of almost unimaginable rarity: the ring of Cadmus Peverell with its Peverell coat of arms scratched into the stone, and the golden locket of Salazar Slytherin himself, a heavy oval of gold marked with a serpentine letter S set in glittering green stones. By any reckoning, these were treasures beyond price, heirlooms that any museum of magic, if such a thing had existed, would have longed to hold. And still, for all of that, the Gaunts were poor. Not merely modest, not merely careful with their money in the way that the Weasleys were careful, but truly, grindingly, wretchedly poor. Poorer than almost any pure blood family in Britain. They lived, in the last generations of their line, in a small and filthy cottage hidden in a hollow of trees near the Muggle village of Little Hangleton. A house so choked with nettles and grime and neglect that it looked more like an abandoned shed than the seat of an ancient family. There was a dead snake nailed to the door, for the Gaunts spoke the language of serpents, the rare gift of Parseltongue that had come down to them from Slytherin, and they wore this ability like a crown even as they had nothing else. Inside, the rooms were dark and cramped and hung with the smell of decay. Little food, little comfort, little warmth. The wealth of 1,000 years had trickled away, spent and squandered and lost across the generations, until nothing remained but the 2 heirlooms, the ring worn upon a finger and the locket worn against a throat, guarded with a jealous and feverish pride, while the family who guarded them went hungry. And what had done this to them? What had emptied their coffers while leaving their blood so pure? The answer, told gently, is that they had married only among themselves and among a shrinking circle of families they judged worthy, generation after generation, refusing to let a single drop of what they called lesser blood enter their veins, until the constant marrying of cousin to cousin had left the family narrowed and weakened and touched, in its final members, by instability and by cruelty and by a kind of slow madness. The last of the Gaunts were an old man named Marvolo, violent and raging and consumed by his own grandeur, and his 2 children, a son called Morphin, who was as wild and dangerous as his father. and a daughter called Merab, who was quiet and frightened and beaten down, the least regarded soul in that miserable house. They had traded away every acre of land, every coin of gold their ancestors had gathered, and all that was left to them was the boast of their ancestry and the two glinting objects they would sooner have starved than sell. Think, for a moment, of how much that pride cost them, and how little it gave back. A family that could have sold the locket of Slytherin for a mountain of gold, that could have lived in comfort and ease for 100 years on the worth of a single one of their heirlooms, chose instead to sit in filth and to go on boasting of a greatness that no one outside their own crumbling walls could any longer see. They had convinced themselves that their blood made them better than the tidy wizards and witches in the fine houses down the lane, better than the muggles in the village nearby, better than everyone. And that conviction was the one thing they could never barter or lose, and so they held to it, while everything else slipped through their fingers like water. There is a strange and sorrowful lesson folded into that. The lesson that a person may be surrounded by treasure and still be starving, may possess the rarest things in the world and still be among the most wretched, if the thing they most prize cannot be spent, cannot be shared, and cannot be turned to any warmth. It was Merab, in the end, who was the mother of Voldemort, though she never lived to see what her child became, and it was through her sad and gentle line that the blood of Slytherin and the blood of Cadmus Peverell passed into the boy who would call himself Lord Voldemort. And here, if you follow the threads back far enough, you find the quiet astonishment that this whole long story has been circling toward. For that same descent from the Peverell brothers meant that Harry Potter and the wizard who hunted him were, in the most distant and tangled way, kin to one another, two boys grown from the same ancient root, one raised in a house of care and gold, the other born in a house of squalor and pride. The Gaunts prove something that the proud families never wished to admit, and it is worth holding on to as your eyes grow heavy. Blood was never the same thing as wealth. The purest lineage in all of Britain sat shivering in a filthy cottage with a dead snake on the door, hoarding a golden locket while there was scarcely bread on the table, so certain of their own greatness that they let their fortune and their family and their very minds crumble around them. Purity of blood, that thing so many chased and boasted of, could not conjure a single galleon. It could not warm a cold room, or mend a broken roof, or fill an empty stomach. The Gaunts had descent from a founder of Hogwarts, and from one of the three brothers of legend, and they had, at the last, almost nothing else at all. So when you remember the gold that waited for Harry in his vault at Gringotts, the neat piles of coins that his parents and his grandparents had gathered through healing and cleverness and honest invention, hold beside it this other picture, the hollow near Little Hangleton, the nettles and the grime, the ring and the locket clutched by hands that trembled with hunger and rage. The Potter fortune, you begin to see, was not a thing of blood at all, for the family richest in blood was among the poorest in the land. Wealth in the wizarding world, as in every world, was made and lost by other things entirely, by care and by ruin, by generosity and by pride. And with that gentle truth settling over you, we can let the sad old house of Gaunt sink back into its shadowed hollow and rest. To understand where the Potters truly stood among the old families of the wizarding world, it helps to lay three of those families gently side by side, the way you might arrange three portraits along a quiet hallway before turning down the lamps, and to look at each of them in turn without hurry, letting the differences settle softly into place. For the wizarding world had its rich and its poor, its grand manors and its crooked leaning houses. And the strange thing, the thing worth drifting slowly toward as sleep comes closer, is that the money and the so-called purity of blood did not always travel together. They were, in truth, two quite separate things, and the families of magical Britain proved it over and over, in their vaults, in their gardens, and in the tired lines of their faces. Begin with the Malfoys, who lived in a great sprawling manor in Wiltshire, all pale stone and dark yew hedges clipped into severe and silent shapes, with peacocks pale as ghosts drifting across the wide lawns. The Malfoys were old, and the Malfoys were wealthy, and they wanted very much for everyone to know both of those things at once. Their gold had gathered slowly across many centuries, through careful marriages and shrewd dealings, and a long habit of standing close to whoever happened to hold power at the time. Their name itself carried the whisper of bad faith, of cunning rather than kindness, and their fortune had been kept and grown, not by inventing anything or healing anyone, but by guarding what they had with a cold and constant vigilance. They belonged, of course, to that famous list of families that called themselves the Sacred 28, the roll of households said to be truly pure of blood. And they wore that, belonging like a heavy jeweled cloak, heavier perhaps than it needed to be. Their wealth was real, and their manner was grand. Yet there was a chill in those halls, a sense that the gold had been polished so long it had forgotten what warmth was for. Beside them sat that other great and gloomy house, the family of Black, whose motto spoke openly of blood staying pure, and who kept a tall, narrow townhouse hidden in the heart of Muggle London at number 12, Grimmauld Place, tucked between ordinary doors that no ordinary eye could ever see. The Blacks were among the very oldest of the pure bloodlines, and they had been rich for so long that the richness had soaked into the very walls, into the dark, heavy furniture, the tarnished silver, the moth-eaten tapestry that traced their family tree back through the centuries in threads of faded gold. Their house was crammed with treasures gathered by generations who never had to sell a single one of them, lockets and goblets and old dark heirlooms. And their vaults at the Wizarding Bank held gold that had simply sat and waited, gathering its quiet weight through year upon patient year. The Blacks, like the Malfoys, prized their bloodline above almost everything, and they were fierce and proud and often cruel about it, burning the names of any relatives who married beneath their standards or loved the wrong sort of people clean off that great tapestry. Yet here again the lesson repeats itself softly, for all their pride of blood. What made the Blacks comfortable was not their purity at all, but simply centuries of inherited gold that no one among them had ever needed to earn. And now turn to the third portrait, and let your shoulders loosen a little, for it is a warmer one. The Weasleys lived far from any grand manor, in a tall, crooked house they called the Burrow, near the village of Ottery St. Catchpole, a house that looked as though it had once been a small stone pigpen, and had then grown upward in happy accidental stages, held together, some said, only by magic and by love. The Weasleys were pure blood too, every bit as ancient in their lineage as the Malfoys or the Blacks, descended from the same deep roots of magical Britain. And yet, the Weasleys were poor. Their robes were often second-hand and gently mended. Their books came down worn from older brothers to younger ones. Their table was crowded, and their gold was thin. And they knew the small daily arithmetic of a family that had to count its coins with care. The reason for their poverty was not any weakness in their blood, for their blood was as pure as anyone could ever claim. The reason was simpler and kinder and sadder all at once. They had no great inventor in their past, no ancestor who had struck upon some clever potion that the world would pay for, no long habit of hoarding, and above all they had chosen, generation after generation, to be warm and open and good, to welcome those that the proud families scorned, and warmth of that sort rarely fills a vault. The other pure blood houses looked down their noses at the Weasleys and called them blood traitors for it, as though kindness were a kind of disgrace, and the Weasleys wore that scorn without shame, richer in every way that could not be counted in gold. So set the three of them together in the quiet hallway of the mind, the cold, rich Malfoys, the proud, rich Blacks, and the poor, warm Weasleys. All three of them pure blood, all three of them ancient, and yet as different in their fortunes as three families could possibly be. And there, drawn plainly before you, is the gentle truth that this whole long story keeps returning to. The truth that among wizards, wealth and blood status were never the same thing at all. A family could be pure of blood and drowning in gold like the Malfoys and the Blacks. A family could be pure of blood and quietly poor like the Weasleys. Purity, whatever the proud households liked to pretend, guaranteed nothing about the weight of a vault. Money came from other sources entirely, from invention, from inheritance, from luck, from the slow, patient gathering of centuries, and sometimes from nothing at all. Which brings us, softly, to the question of where the Potters sat among these families. And the answer is a curious and rather lovely one, for the Potters did not fit neatly into any of the three portraits at all. They were old as the Blacks, with a lineage reaching back many hundreds of years to a gentle healer who had earned the family its first gold through kindness and cleverness rather than pride. They were rich, comfortably and genuinely rich, their vault well filled, their lives free of the daily arithmetic that pressed on the Weasleys. And yet, unlike the Malfoys and the Blacks, the Potters had never appeared on that famous list of the Sacred 28, not because they lacked the ancient blood to qualify, for they had it in abundance, but because they had always been too warm, too open, too willing to marry whom they loved and to welcome those born to Muggle families. In that openness, they were the truest cousins of the Weasleys, sharing the same generous heart, the same refusal to measure people by the thinness or thickness of their blood. But where the Weasleys had stayed poor, the Potters had grown wealthy, their fortune built not on hoarding and not on purity, but on healing and invention, and the slow, honest work of many careful hands across many careful centuries. The Potters, then, were something rare in the wizarding world. They held the wealth of the Malfoys and the Blacks in one hand, and the warm, open heart of the Weasleys in the other, and they carried both together without contradiction. Proof made flesh that gold and goodness need not be strangers to each other. And so, as the three portraits fade back into the soft dark of the hallway, let this quiet thought stay with you as you drift. That the richest families were not always the proudest, and the proudest were not always the kindest, and that the Potters, in their gentle, uncommon way, had somehow managed to be comfortable and good at the very same time. There is a strange and tender truth about the way fortunes travel through the wizarding world, and it is this: that gold does not always come to a person through their own blood or their own labor, but sometimes arrives through love, through the quiet decision of one heart to name another as its own. Harry Potter had already inherited a fortune, of course, the long, patient wealth of the Potters that lay waiting for him in Vault 687, gathered across the centuries from a gentle healer, from a rare and shining cloak, and from a hair potion that had made the family truly rich. That inheritance alone would have carried him comfortably through 100 lifetimes. Yet the world had one more surprise saved for him, a second fortune that he never asked for, never imagined, and never for a single moment would have chosen over the person who gave it. And to understand that second fortune, we must speak softly of a man named Sirius Black. Sirius was Harry's godfather, chosen for that role by James and Lily themselves in the happier years before the darkness fell. And he came from one of the oldest and wealthiest of the pure blood families, the House of Black, a family so proud of its ancient lineage that it embroidered its motto onto everything it touched. The Blacks had gathered gold for many generations, and they kept it in the deep goblin vaults of Gringotts, just as the Potters did. And they kept their great gloomy townhouse in London, and they kept, in the old cruel fashion of such families, a house elf bound to serve them. Sirius himself had run away from all of it as a young man, sickened by the bigotry and the coldness of his relatives, and for years he wanted nothing to do with the Black name or the Black money. But when his mother died and his younger brother died, and the family dwindled away until scarcely anyone was left, Sirius became, whether he wished it or not, the last true son of the House of Black, and everything that the family had hoarded came quietly to rest in his hands. And so when Harry, at 15 years old, lost his godfather in the most sudden and heartbreaking of ways, on the night that Sirius fell through the veil in the Department of Mysteries, he discovered in the aching weeks that followed that Sirius had left everything to him. There had been no reason to expect it, for the two of them had known each other only a few short years, and Sirius had come into Harry's life so late and been torn from it so cruelly. Yet Sirius had loved the boy as fiercely as any father might have done, had seen in him the living echo of his dearest friend James, and had wanted, above all things, to give Harry the home and the belonging that the war had stolen from them both. To name Harry his heir was the truest way Sirius knew to say that this boy was his family. And so, in death, he handed over the whole of the Black inheritance to the godson he had barely been allowed to know. The first part of that inheritance was the Black family gold, and it was no small sum. The Blacks had been rich for centuries, as rich in their way as the Malfoys, and their vault held a great weight of galleons gathered by generations of a proud and grasping family. Overnight, and without lifting a finger, Harry became the master of two fortunes at once: the Potter gold that his parents had left him, and the Black gold that his godfather had left him. Two rivers of ancient wealth flowing together into the hands of a single orphaned boy. He who had grown up in a cupboard beneath a staircase, wearing clothes many sizes too large, and believing himself to be nothing and nobody, now held more gold than almost any young wizard alive, and yet the doubling of his fortune brought him no joy at all, for every coin of the new inheritance was a reminder of the man he would gladly have traded all the gold in Gringotts to have back. The second part of the inheritance was the house, the tall, dark townhouse at number 12 Grimmauld Place, hidden in a quiet London square where the Muggles walked past without ever seeing it. This was the ancestral home of the Blacks, a narrow, gloomy building full of shadowed portraits and cursed heirlooms, and the mounted heads of old house elves upon the wall, and it had become, in the years of the war, the secret headquarters of the Order of the Phoenix, the very fellowship to which Harry's own parents had once belonged. Now it belonged to Harry, the house that had sheltered the fight against Voldemort, the house where he had spent one strange summer in the company of the people who loved him, passed into his ownership entirely, and in time it would become for him not merely a possession, but a refuge and a home of his very own. The third part of the inheritance was the strangest of all, for it was not a treasure of gold or stone, but a living creature, the old house elf named Creature, who had served the Blacks for as long as anyone could remember. Creature had grown bitter and half-mad in his long, lonely years within that cold house, muttering to the portrait of his dead mistress, clinging to the old prejudices. And at first he wanted nothing to do with the boy who had inherited him. Yet by the ancient laws of house elf bondage, when Harry inherited the Black estate, he inherited Creature too, and this troubled Harry deeply, for he had never wished to own a living being, and the thought of possessing a servant sat uneasily upon his kind and gentle heart. There was even a frightening moment when it seemed the inheritance might not take hold at all. For the magic of the old house tested whether a half-blood outsider could truly become the master of so proud a pure-blood home. And only when Creature answered Harry's command did it become certain that everything, house and elf and gold alike, was now truly his. And so we come to the heart of what that doubled inheritance meant. For it is a thing worth turning over slowly in the quiet of the night. Harry Potter, the boy raised in poverty and neglect, the boy who had never known that a single coin waited for him anywhere in the world, became by the age of 15 the heir to two of the oldest fortunes in wizarding Britain, and the master of a great house, and the keeper of an ancient family's gold. If wealth alone could make a person happy, Harry ought to have been the happiest young wizard who ever lived. Yet the truth that shines through this whole tale is that the gold meant almost nothing to him, that he would have poured every galleon of both fortunes into the sea without a second thought to have his godfather stand beside him once more, warm and laughing and alive. The black inheritance was never really about the money at all. It was about a man who had lost everything, his youth, his freedom, his best friends, and who chose, with the last gift left in his power, to tell a lonely boy that he was loved, that he belonged, that he had a family after all. So the two fortunes came to rest together, the potter and the black. The gold of the healer and the inventor joined now to the gold of the proud old house in London, and Harry carried them both without pride and without greed, understanding better than anyone that the truest riches he had ever been given were not the ones that could be counted in a vault. Let that thought settle over you gently now, like a warm blanket drawn up in the dark. The quiet knowledge that the things most worth inheriting are never really made of gold. And let your breathing slow, and let the old house grow still, and let sleep come softly down. For all the gold we have counted together, for all the galleons stacked in vault 687, and the second and older fortune of the House of Black that came to Harry so unexpectedly, there is a gentle truth waiting at the bottom of this long story, and it is this, that the things Harry treasured most from his parents were never the coins at all. When we imagine an inheritance, we tend to picture heavy things, chests and deeds and rows of glinting metal. But the deepest bequests in Harry's life weighed almost nothing at all, and one of them could be folded small enough to slip into a pocket, and another was only a thin sheaf of paper, and the greatest of them could not be held in the hands in any way, because it lived inside him and around him, like the memory of warmth after a fire has gone out. Consider first the cloak, that shimmering water-like fabric that had traveled down through the family for longer than anyone living could truly reckon. It had come into the Potters far back in the mist of centuries, carried through the marriage of Iolanthe Peverell into the line, and it was one of the three fabled Deathly Hallows, the very cloak that the youngest of the three brothers had used to greet death as an old friend rather than to be caught by him. Most invisibility cloaks in the wizarding world are humble, imperfect things, woven with a demiguise hair or treated with a charm that fades and frays and grows patchy with the passing of years. But this one never dimmed, never aged, never surrendered its power to time. James Potter had lent it, before the end, to Albus Dumbledore, who studied it quietly and understood far better than James ever guessed exactly what treasure had passed through his hands. And so, on Harry's very first Christmas at Hogwarts, the cloak returned to the boy who had never known his father, arriving wrapped and unsigned save for a small note that told him only that it had once belonged to James, and that it was time it was returned to its owner. Think of the tenderness folded into that gift, a father's own possession traveling across the gulf of death and the gulf of years to settle at last upon the shoulders of a son who had almost no other physical thing of his to hold. The cloak was not merely a curiosity, and it was not merely useful, though it was certainly both of those things across the long adventures of his school days. It was a thread of continuity, a living proof that Harry belonged to a chain of people who had loved and hidden and protected one another for 1,000 years, and that he was the newest link in that quiet, unbroken chain. When he drew it over himself in the dark corridors of the castle, he was doing what Gringotts had done, and Hardwin, and generations of potters whose names have slipped from the record, and in that simple act he was never quite as alone as he believed himself to be. Then there was the firebolt, and here the giving came not from his father, but from his godfather, Sirius Black. It arrived in the very same secret way, without a name attached, a magnificent racing broom of the finest make in all the world, sleek and dark and humming with power, delivered at a moment when Harry's old broom had been shattered against the whomping willow, and he had nothing left to fly. Sirius, hunted and hiding and unable to give his godson anything openly, poured what he could into that single splendid object, and it was more than a broom. It was a message. It was a man saying across danger and distance that he was watching, that he cared, that the boy was not forgotten. To fly upon the firebolt was, for Harry, to feel for a few soaring minutes the presence of a family that wanted him, and that is worth more than any number of coins locked safely in a bank. And there was the photograph album, perhaps the softest treasure of them all, given to Harry at the close of his first year by Rubeus Hagrid, who had gently gathered pictures from everyone who had known James and Lily. It was a thick book full of moving images, his mother laughing, his father waving, the two of them young and alive and utterly unaware of the shadow that was coming for them. And Harry, who had grown up believing he had no face to attach to the aching word parents, could now turn the pages and watch them smile at him. No goblin vault could have held anything so precious as that. Gold can buy a great many things in the wizarding world or the ordinary one, but it cannot buy back a mother's laugh, and here that laugh had been preserved and handed to a boy who had never once heard it while she lived. Yet beneath the cloak and the firebolt and the album, older than the Sleekeazy fortune and deeper than the Peverell magic, lay the truest inheritance of all, and it was the one thing Harry carried without ever being able to see it. When Lily Potter stood before her son's cradle on that last night in Godric's Hollow and refused to step aside, when she chose her own death over his and asked for nothing in return, she wove a protection into his very skin that no wealth could have purchased and no dark magic could easily undo. It was the oldest magic there is, the magic of a love freely given to the point of sacrifice, and it lived in his blood for years, a shield his enemy could not touch and could not comprehend. Voldemort had riches enough at his command, and followers, and terror, and yet he was undone again and again by a defense that cost Lily everything and left Harry marked forever by being loved. That was the Potter fortune in its purest and most concentrated form, not counted in coins but measured in the willingness of a mother to give her life without hesitation. So let us gently set the gold aside for a moment, the way one sets aside a plate when the meal is done, and look at what remained when the counting stopped. A cloak that whispered of belonging, a broom that carried a godfather's love, a book of faces that gave a lonely child his parents back, and a sacrifice so complete that it became a kind of armor. These are the inheritances that shaped who Harry became, far more than the contents of any vault beneath the London streets. The family had been comfortable, yes, wealthy even, thanks to a gentle healer long ago, and a clever grandfather with his hair potion. and that comfort mattered in its small and steady way. But if you asked the grown man, Harry became what his parents had truly left him. He would not have reached first for the galleons. He would have thought of the soft weight of the cloak, and the smiling pictures, and above all the certainty, carried always somewhere in his chest, that he had been wanted, and had been loved enough to be worth dying for. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson at the very heart of this whole long tale of Potter riches, that fortunes can be built on care, and on cleverness, and on happy chance, and that they can pass from hand to hand for 1,000 years. But the part of any inheritance that truly endures is never the metal in the strong room. It is the love folded into the gift, and the memory pressed between the pages, and the tenderness that outlasts the giver. That was always the deepest vault in the Potter name, and it was never locked, and it never ran empty, and it belonged to Harry from the very first breath he ever took. And so we come, softly and without any hurry, to the end of our long wandering through the story of the Potter gold. And there is nothing left now but to gather the whole answer gently into our hands, and hold it there for a little while before we let it go. We asked, at the very beginning, a simple question that sounded almost like the sort of thing a curious child might whisper in the dark. And the question was this: why were Harry's parents so rich? And where did all that gold in the little cart under London truly come from? We have followed the answer back and back, through vaults and villages and centuries, and now that we stand at the end of the road, we can see that the answer was never one single thing. It was not a buried treasure, and it was not a stroke of luck, and it was not the cold accident of a pure and ancient name. It was, instead, 3 quiet inheritances, laid one upon another, like the soft folded layers of a warm blanket, gathered slowly over more than 800 years, and then joined, near the very end, by a 4th. Think of it for a moment as a house that no single hand ever built, a house that grew instead a little at a time, one gentle room added by each generation, until the whole of it stood warm and sturdy and full of light, and Harry, without ever lifting a stone, was simply born inside it and given the keys. The first layer was the oldest and in many ways the tenderest, and it belonged to a gentle man named Linfred of Stinchcombe, who lived in the 12th century and was loved by his neighbors so warmly that they gave him the fond little nickname, the Potterer, because he was forever pottering about with his cauldrons and his cures. He was a healer, and the remedies he brewed in his cottage were the far ancestors of potions the wizarding world would one day take entirely for granted, the ones that mend broken bones and chase away the shivers of a cold. He asked little, and he gave much, and the grateful people around him repaid his kindness with gold and with land. And when he died, he left that gold and that land to his children. And so the very first stones of the Potter fortune were not laid by greed at all, but by the patient, ordinary work of making other people well. The second layer came not as coins, but as something stranger and softer and far more precious than any coin could ever be. When Linfred's eldest son Hardwin married a young woman named Iolantha Peverell, she carried into the family a treasure that had passed down from her grandfather Ignatius, the youngest and wisest of the 3 Peverell brothers of the oldest story of all. It was the Cloak of Invisibility, one of the 3 fabled Deathly Hallows, a thing so rare that most witches and wizards believed it to be only a tale told to children. Into the house of Potter it came, and quietly from parent to child to grandchild, across long centuries and countless bedtimes, it was handed on and on, never sold, never traded, never spent, until at last it settled into the hands of a boy named Harry, who would come to understand that some inheritances are worth far more than the metal in a vault. The third layer was the one that made the family not merely comfortable, but genuinely, unmistakably rich, and it belonged to Harry's grandfather, a man with the lovely old name of Fleamont Potter. Fleamont had a clever, practical mind, and he invented a hair potion called Sleekeazy, a smoothing tonic that tamed even the most stubborn and unruly hair. And it sold and sold and sold across the whole wizarding world. So beloved that a girl named Hermione would one day reach for a small bottle of it before a Christmas ball long after Fleamont was gone. That single gentle invention quadrupled the family gold 4 times over, and when Fleamont at last grew old, he sold the company and retired a very wealthy man. And it was this deep and settled fortune that his son James would inherit, the fortune that let James grow up never needing to work a single day for his bread. And then, near the very end, long after James and Lily were gone, there came a 4th layer that Harry never expected and never asked for. His godfather Sirius Black, of the rich and ancient House of Black, left him everything he had: the old dark house in London, the surly house elf, and all the heavy black gold, so that a boy who had begun with a single vault beneath the city found himself heir to a second fortune he had done nothing to earn except to be loved by a man who had no one else to leave it to. And that, perhaps, is the truest thread running through the whole of it, for notice, as we drift here at the end, what every layer has in common. The healer's gold came from kindness. The cloak came down through marriage and through the careful love of parents, passing something treasured to their children. The great fortune came from cleverness, from a bright and patient mind that made a useful thing. And the last gift of all came from friendship and from grief, from one lonely man's love for the son of the friends he had lost. Nowhere in this long story is the Potter wealth built upon pride of blood, and that is worth remembering as your eyes grow heavy. For the Potters were never even counted among the so-called pure families, being far too kind and too welcoming toward those of Muggle birth to be trusted by the people who cared about such things. Their gold was never a badge of purity. It was a record of care and of cleverness and of love, quietly compounding across the generations. We saw, too, how gently the world reminds us that blood and gold are not the same, for there were the Gaunts, as pure of blood as any family could claim to be, and yet sunk into ruin and rags, selling off their last precious heirlooms in a crumbling hovel. And there were the warm and cheerful Weasleys, pure of blood as well, and yet never wealthy, rich only in one another. Wealth, the story tells us, was never a thing you were simply owed for being born the right sort. It was made and kept and passed along, or else it slipped away. And so the gold in Vault 687, the gold that so amazed a boy who had grown up in a cupboard beneath the stairs, was in truth a kind of message left for him by people he would never meet. A message written not in words, but in coins and in a folded cloak, saying, in the only way they could, that he came from a long line of people who had chosen to be kind and clever and generous, and that he was loved. So there is the whole answer, gathered now and complete, and you may set it down. Harry's parents were rich because a gentle healer once loved his village, because a rare cloak came into the family and was cherished rather than sold, because a grandfather invented something clever and kind, and because, in the end, a devoted godfather had a boy to leave his fortune to. Care and cleverness and love, layered soft and deep across 800 quiet years. There is nothing more now that you need to hold on to. You can let the vaults grow dim and let the little cart come to rest in the dark beneath the city. You can let Linfred close his cottage door for the night, and let the old cloak lie folded and still, and let Fleamont's bottles gleam softly on their forgotten shelf. Let the coins settle and let the counting stop. The whole long story has been told, and told well, and it will keep itself perfectly safe until morning without any help from you at all. Your only task now is to grow warm and heavy and slow, to feel the weight of the blankets and the softness beneath you, and to let each breath come a little deeper and a little quieter than the one before. The gold is counted, the tale is done, and you may drift, gently and completely, down into the soft and welcoming dark, where nothing is owed and nothing is needed, and everything, at last, is calm. And so we come to the end of the long, quiet tale of the Potter fortune, gathered gently for you in the dark. If it kept you soft company tonight, you are always welcome to tap subscribe, so that another slow and gentle story can find its way back to you again. For now, let every thought and every worry drift away, and simply rest. Good night.